Hello, my friend. Welcome back. Or if this is your first time here, welcome in. Before we begin, this little channel only exists because people like you decide quietly it's worth a small gesture. If you subscribe, it simply starts finding its way back to you. No searching required the next time you can't sleep. A like helps too. It costs nothing and tells me these stories are worth making more of. While you're settling in, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Somewhere quiet in Sydney, a flat in Florida, everything gone still, a house outside London, your dog curled up nearby. Leave a comment and tell me. I always read every single one. Now, dim the lights. Let your body go heavy. Comfortable? Good. Let's go. The river is the first thing to change. Before anything else in the village stirs, before the fires are lit or the doors are opened, the surface of the Nile turns from black to a kind of dull pewter, and then, so gradually you would miss it if you blinked, to a pale rose gold that seems to come from underneath the water rather than above it. This is not the Grand Nile of temple walls and painted tombs. This is a bend in the river a few days south of the nearest large town, where the water moves slow and wide past a cluster of mud brick houses that have stood, in one form or another, for longer than anyone living there could tell you. No monuments here, no processions, just a village waking up the way it always does, the way it did yesterday, the way it will tomorrow. A man named Nakt is already down by the water. He is not important, not in the way that word usually gets used. He will never be written about. No one will carve his name into stone, and there is something in that fact I find myself genuinely drawn to, rather than saddened by, if that makes sense. He is simply a fisherman, the son of a fisherman, and in a few minutes his own son will come stumbling down the path, rubbing sleep out of his eyes, to help him with the boat. Right now, though, Nakt is alone, crouched at the edge of the reeds, checking the ropes on a small papyrus boat that has carried him out onto this water more mornings than he could ever count. The reeds make a particular sound in the very early morning, a kind of dry whisper when the breeze moves through them, and somewhere behind him, back up toward the houses, a dog barks once, and then thinks better of it. Maybe you know a man like Nakt, not an Egyptian fisherman specifically, of course, but someone whose whole identity is quietly built around one task done well, morning after morning, without much fuss made over it. A father who gets up before everyone else, a grandfather who still, even now, cannot sleep past dawn. There is a rhythm to lives like that which crosses thousands of years without much trouble at all, and I think that is part of why this particular morning, on this particular river, so long ago, still feels close enough to reach out and touch. Here is the detail that gets me every time I sit with this period of history. Nuck does not own this stretch of river. Not in the way we would think of ownership, but he does not need to. The Nile simply gives, on a schedule so reliable that an entire civilization built its calendar around it, and there is something almost unsettling in how gentle that dependency was. A people whose entire survival rested on a river being predictable, year after year, flood after flood, and mostly, for most of their history, it simply was. Imagine trusting something that completely. Imagine a whole culture organizing its sense of time, its religion, its taxes, its festivals, around the quiet good behaviour of a river. Smoke is already beginning to rise from between the houses, thin grey threads going straight up into air that has not yet been stirred by wind. Someone is baking bread. You can smell it before you can see it. That particular scent of scorched clay and grain that has nothing else in the world quite like it. Not this early version of it anyway. Not before the yeast and the heat have finished their work and the loaf has gone properly golden. A woman named Meret is crouched beside a low-domed oven built from the same mud as the walls of her house, and she has been awake longer than Nakt has. Bread does not wait for anyone, and in this village, as in most of Egypt, bread is not a side dish to a meal. Bread is the meal, most days, alongside beer, and Meret's mornings are built entirely around getting both of those things right before the heat of the day makes the work unbearable. Bread making in a house like Meret starts the night before, Though she would not think of it that way. It is simply what you do before you sleep, the way you might set out clothes for the morning. Grain gets ground on a stone that never leaves its spot in the corner of the courtyard, a flat slab with a smaller stone worked back and forth across it by hand, and this grinding is one of those tasks that shape the bodies of the women who did it for a living. There is something almost uncomfortable in that thought, the way a whole life of labour leaves its mark on bone and joint, and archaeologists have actually found this in the skeletons themselves, worn vertebrae, worn knees, the quiet physical cost of feeding a household. I do not say that to make the morning feel heavy. I say it because it is true, and because Moret herself would probably shrug at the observation. This is simply what a morning is. The flour gets mixed with water, sometimes with a bit of the previous day's dough kept back to help it rise, sometimes with dates or herbs folded in if there is something worth celebrating, and the dough goes into shapes that would look strange to us now, cones and triangles and thick flat rounds, pressed onto the hot inner walls of the oven or set into heated moulds buried in the coals. And here is the detail that always surprises people. All that grinding on stone left tiny fragments of sand and mineral in the flour itself, and archaeologists studying Egyptian mummies have found their teeth worn down almost to nothing by decades of eating bread that was, in a very literal sense, a little bit gritty. Not enough to notice day to day. Enough, over 40 years, to change the shape of a jaw. The beer brewing happens nearby, and it is worth saying clearly, because it surprises people every time, that beer was not a luxury or an indulgence in this world. It was closer to a food than a drink, thick, nourishing, low in the kind of intoxication we associate with the word today, and everyone drank it, children included, in small, careful amounts, because the water of the Nile itself was not always something you wanted to trust straight from the river. The brewing process starts with barley bread, deliberately baked to be undercooked in the centre, crumbled into water, left to ferment with whatever wild yeast happens to be present in the air of that particular kitchen. Every house's beer would have tasted slightly different because of that, a kind of accidental signature belonging to no one in particular. Meret's daughter is awake now too, a girl of about 9 who has already learned to help with the smaller tasks, fetching water, watching the youngest child, fanning the coals when the fire needs more air and less smoke. Her name is Tabiri, and she moves around the courtyard with the particular unhurried competence of a child who has grown up inside a routine rather than being taught it as a lesson. She's not thinking about any of this as remarkable. To her it is simply Tuesday, if they had such a word for it, which they did not. Their days were marked instead by festivals and flood stages, and the position of certain stars, a whole different architecture of time laid over the same 24 hours we still live inside. Across the narrow lane, in a house built almost identically to Meret's, because most houses in a village like this were, a different kind of morning is unfolding. This is the home of a man named Senbi, a farmer, and his morning does not begin with fire, it begins with feet in the mud. The flood has receded weeks earlier, leaving behind that dark, almost black silt that Egyptians themselves called Kemet, the Black Land, a name so central to how they understood their own country that it eventually became one of the words they used for Egypt itself. Senbi is out checking the boundary markers between his strip of land and his neighbours, small stone or wooden posts that mattered enormously, because the flood erased every visible line each year, and someone had to remember exactly where one man's field ended and another's began. This is where the office of the rope stretcher comes in, and it is one of those small facts that tends to lodge itself in people's memory once they hear it. Trained surveyors, using knotted cords stretched taut across the land, would come through after the flood to re-establish boundaries with real mathematical precision, and this practice, this necessity of remeasuring the world every single year, is part of what pushed Egyptian mathematics and geometry forward as far as it went. Not some abstract love of numbers for their own sake. Mud, boundaries, a farmer who needed to know, with certainty, that the field he was about to plant was still his. Senbi's wife, a woman named Iset, is not in the field this morning. She's inside tending to something that would surprise a lot of people, which is a small household shrine set into a niche in the wall, not grand, not gilded, just a modest painted figure and a few offerings, a bit of bread, a small dish of water. Religion in a house like this was not a Sunday activity, separate from the rest of life. It was woven directly into the architecture, present in the corner of every room, the way a family photograph might be present in a house today. Iset murmurs something to the figure. Not a formal prayer exactly, more like the kind of quiet address you might make to a grandmother who has passed, but whose presence you still feel in certain rooms. This particular household god, a squat, wide-mouthed figure named Bez, was not one of the great state deities you would find carved into temple walls. He was something closer to a household protector, associated with childbirth, with sleep, with keeping bad dreams away from children, and I find that detail quietly moving. The idea of an entire civilization deciding that some gods belong to kings and temples, and other gods belong to mothers and bedrooms and the particular fear of what might happen in the dark. There is a paradox sitting underneath all of this, one that is easy to miss if you only picture Egypt through its monuments. This was a civilization utterly obsessed with permanence, with carving names into stone precisely so they would outlast flesh, and yet the actual daily lives of most Egyptians left almost nothing behind at all. Mud brick dissolves. Wooden furniture rots. The vast majority of what we know about ordinary life comes not from grand structures, but from rubbish heaps, from discarded scraps of writing, from the accidental preservation of things nobody thought worth protecting. The people who lived the most, in sheer number of hours, in this world, are also the people history nearly swallowed whole, and yet here we are, still able to reach back and find Meret's bread and Senbi's boundary markers, because enough small things survived by accident that we can piece together what care alone could not have preserved. Back down at the river, Nakat's son has arrived, a boy of about 11 named Pentu, still rubbing one eye with the back of his hand, his sandals, simple things made of woven papyrus or palm leaf, slapping softly against the packed earth path. Children in Egyptian villages did not experience anything resembling a modern childhood of pure leisure, but they were not miniature adults either, not in the way some cultures across history have treated them. There was room for play here, for actual games, and archaeologists have found small toys, wooden animals with legs that could be made to move by pulling a string, spinning tops, balls stitched together from leather and stuffed with straw or chaff. Pentu, though, this particular morning is mostly focused on not falling asleep standing up, while his father shows him, for what must be the 100th time, how to check a net for weak spots before it goes into the water. Fishing on the Nile was not a single uniform activity. Some men worked from small reed boats close to shore, using throw nets or simple hooks, while others, working in pairs or small groups, used larger nets stretched between two boats, walking the fish towards shallow water where they could be more easily caught. There is a particular kind of skill in reading the surface of a river, in knowing where the fish are likely to be gathered by the temperature of the water or the time of year, and this is exactly the kind of knowledge that never gets written down anywhere. Because why would it be? Everyone who needed to know it learned it the same way Pentu is learning it now, by standing beside someone who already knew. The fish itself, once caught, would be split and laid out to dry in the sun on wooden racks near the house, an ancient and remarkably effective form of preservation that meant a good catch did not have to be eaten all at once. Salted and sun-dried fish could last for months, an important hedge against the parts of the year when the river gave less generously. And here is a small, strange fact that tends to surprise people. Certain fish, in certain regions of Egypt, were considered sacred, associated with particular gods, and eating them was taboo in those areas, while in a village just a short distance away, the exact same fish might be a normal part of dinner. Religion in this world was not always uniform even within one country. It shifted by region, by local tradition, by which God happened to be most honoured in that particular stretch of the river. The houses themselves deserve a moment, because the version of an Egyptian home that exists in most people's imagination, if it exists at all, tends to be borrowed from tomb paintings of wealthy households, all those bright painted columns and gardens with fish ponds. Most people did not live like that. Most people, families like Meret's and Senbi's and Nakat's, lived in homes built from mud brick, walls a good arm's length thick, which sounds excessive until you remember what those walls were for. Thick mud walls hold the cool of the night deep into the following day, and keep the worst of the heat out during the long stretch of afternoon when the sun sits directly overhead and even the animals go quiet and still. The roofs were flat, and this detail matters more than it might seem to at first, because a flat roof in this climate was not simply a roof. It was another room, an outdoor one, used for sleeping on the hottest nights, for drying grain and fruit, for storage, for a bit of privacy away from the noise of the ground floor. Inside, a typical home like this had very few rooms by our standards, often just 2 or 3, arranged one behind the other, front room, main living space, and a smaller rear room used for sleeping or storage. Windows were small and set high, more for ventilation than for light, because Egyptians understood something about their own climate that a lot of modern builders in hot places have had to relearn, which is that a small opening high on a wall lets hot air escape while keeping the worst of the direct sun and dust out. The floors were packed earth, sometimes covered with woven mats, and furniture, real furniture, chairs and proper beds, tended to belong to wealthier households. In a house like Meret's, most of daily life happened low, on mats or simple stools, close to the ground, close to the cooking fire, close to the actual texture of the day. There is something I want to pause on here, a detail that quietly reshapes how you might picture this whole world. Excavations of village sites, particularly a well-studied workers' village called Deir el-Medina, though that particular settlement was somewhat unusual in that its residents were skilled craftsmen employed by the state, have shown that ordinary Egyptian homes were often painted, at least in part, with simple geometric patterns or a coat of whitewash, and that households kept small personal items with real individual character, a favorite bowl, a specific style of sandal, tools passed down and clearly repaired multiple times rather than replaced. These were not blank, interchangeable lives. Even inside a strict and highly organized society, individual taste, individual habit, individual preference found room to exist in the corners of a house the way it always has, everywhere, in every century. Back outside, the village is fully awake now. A donkey somewhere is complaining loudly about something, the particular flat, insistent bray that seems designed specifically to be impossible to ignore, and a group of men are gathering near the edge of the fields with wooden hoes and simple ploughs pulled by a pair of oxen. This is not planting season, not quite yet. This is the tail end of the period just after the floodwaters have fully receded, when the land needs to be worked while the soil is still soft and dark and full of the nutrients the river left behind. Egyptian agriculture ran on a calendar with 3 seasons rather than 4, built entirely around the behavior of the Nile itself. Akhet, the flooding, when the river rose and covered the fields and very little farming happened at all. Peret, the growing season, when the water had receded and crops went into the exposed fertile ground. And Shemu, the harvest, the hot dry stretch when everything that had grown was cut, gathered and stored before the whole cycle began again. I find it worth sitting with, for a moment, how completely a civilization's entire emotional calendar, its festivals, its sense of anxiety or relief, its very idea of what a year even was, could be built around watching a river rise and fall. There is a kind of humility in that, whether or not the Egyptians themselves would have used that word. An empire capable of extraordinary engineering and administration, and still, underneath all of it, entirely at the mercy of water levels no one could fully predict or control. Some years the flood came in perfectly, generous but not destructive. Other years it came too high or too low, and the difference between those years could mean the difference between abundance and real hardship for an entire region. You can hear in some of the surviving records officials measuring flood height on stone markers called millimeters, with something close to real anxiety in their careful notation. Let us step away from the fields for a moment, because there is a market a short walk from the village, held not every day but on a fairly regular rhythm, and it is worth wandering through, slowly, the way you might wander through a market on vacation somewhere, half looking at the goods and half just enjoying the noise and motion of people. Egypt did not use coined money for most of its ancient history, not the way we think of currency today, and this surprises people every single time I mention it. Instead, The whole economy ran largely on barter, on a system where value was measured in standard units, often a weight of copper or grain called a deben, without actual coins ever needing to change hands. A woman might trade a length of linen cloth she had woven herself for a jar of oil and a basket of onions, both sides mentally converting the value of their goods into this shared unit of measurement, and the transaction would be entirely fair, entirely understood, without a single coin present anywhere in it. The market itself is loud in the particular way that open-air markets have always been loud, everywhere, in every century, a layered noise made of separate conversations, the occasional raised voice haggling over the quality of a cut of meat, children weaving between the legs of adults, someone somewhere laughing at a joke you cannot quite hear the beginning of, stalls, if you can even call them that. Some of them are just mats spread on the ground, display pottery, bundles of fresh vegetables, onions and leeks and lettuce, cuts of dried fish, jars of beer, baskets of dates. A man selling sandals is arguing cheerfully with a customer about the quality of his leatherwork, and a woman is inspecting a bolt of linen with the kind of practiced, unhurried scrutiny of someone who has been fooled by bad cloth before and has no intention of being fooled again. Linen deserves its own moment here, because it was, in a very real sense, the fabric of this entire civilization, worn by farmers and nobles alike, though the quality and fineness varied enormously depending on how much a household could afford. It was made from flax, grown in the same fertile fields that produced Egypt's grain, and the process of turning a flax plant into a wearable garment was long and genuinely skilled, involving soaking the stalks until the fibers loosened, then combing, spinning and weaving them into cloth on simple horizontal looms, often operated by women working in pairs. The finest Egyptian linen, the kind reserved for the wealthy or for particular religious uses, was woven so tightly and so fine that some surviving examples are almost translucent, and there are accounts from later visitors to Egypt, Greek and Roman travelers centuries afterward, expressing genuine amazement at cloth so fine it seemed to disappear against the skin. Most ordinary Egyptians, though, wore simpler linen, plain and practical, and clothing styles stayed remarkably consistent across enormous stretches of time, which is itself a strange thing to sit with. A man's simple wrap-around kilt from an early period would not have looked wildly out of place worn 1,000 years later. This was not a culture that prized novelty in fashion the way later societies would come to. There was a kind of quiet confidence in a garment that worked, that suited the climate, that had suited it for generations, and no particular urge to reinvent it just for the sake of change. Children in the market, meanwhile, mostly ran around with no clothing at all, at least the younger ones, which was entirely normal and unremarkable in Egyptian culture, both because of the heat and because clothing itself, especially fine woven cloth, represented real labor and real cost, not something to waste on a body that would outgrow it within a season anyway. Older children and adults dressed according to status and occasion, but there was a practical, unfussy relationship with clothing generally, worn for comfort and coolness first, decoration and status second, though the second consideration mattered a great deal once you moved up the social ladder. There is a woman at one of the mats near the edge of the market selling small clay pots of kohl, the dark eye paint that shows up in nearly every surviving image of Egyptians from every level of society. And I want to slow down on this one, because it is one of those details that people assume was purely decorative, purely about beauty, and it was that, but it was also something else entirely. Kohl, made typically from ground galena, a lead-based mineral, mixed with other ingredients depending on the recipe and the region, was applied thickly around the eyes of men, women and children alike, not as an occasional flourish but as a near universal daily habit. And there is actual scientific research, done fairly recently, suggesting the practice may have had a genuine protective function, reducing glare from the harsh sun and possibly even offering some antibacterial benefit against the kind of eye infections that were common along the river. So a habit that looks, at first glance, like simple vanity may have been doing real medical work the entire time, which I find quietly delightful, the idea that beauty and practicality were never as separate as we sometimes assume they were. Beauty and personal care more broadly occupied a serious amount of daily attention in this world, for men as well as women, which tends to surprise people who assume grooming rituals were somehow a one-sided concern. Egyptians of most social classes bathed regularly, often daily if water access allowed for it, using a paste made from natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, combined with oils, functioning as something close to soap. Oils themselves were essential, not optional, rubbed into the skin daily to counter the drying effect of a hot, dry climate, and wealthier households had access to a range of scented oils, infused with flowers or resins, while poorer households made do with simpler, plainer versions, castor oil or moringa oil, still applied faithfully because the climate demanded it regardless of what you could afford. Hair, too, tells its own quiet story. Many Egyptians, men included, kept their natural hair quite short or shaved it entirely, particularly in the heat of summer, and wore wigs instead, made from human hair or plant fiber, styled elaborately for special occasions and kept simpler for daily wear. This might sound strange until you consider it from a practical standpoint. A wig can be removed at the end of a long hot day, washed, groomed and set aside, in a way that a full head of natural hair cannot, and shaved or closely cropped natural hair underneath was also, quite simply, easier to keep free of lice in a climate where that was a real and constant concern. Even children in many households had their heads shaved except for a single remaining lock of hair on one side, a style you can find again and again in tomb paintings and small carved figures, a lock that would eventually be cut off in a small ceremony, marking the child's passage out of early childhood. Jewelry, meanwhile, was worn by essentially everyone, though of course the materials varied enormously by wealth. Simple beaded necklaces made from faience, a bright blue-green glazed ceramic that Egyptians produced in enormous quantities, adorned farmers and craftsmen alike, while the wealthy wore gold and semi-precious stones, carnelian and turquoise and lapis lazuli, brought in through trade from distant regions. But jewelry in Egypt was rarely just decoration, and this is another one of those details that quietly reshapes the picture. Certain amulets, small pendant charms shaped like specific symbols, a scarab beetle, an ankh, the protective eye of Horus, were worn as much for their believed magical or protective power as for how they looked. A mother might tie a small protective amulet around a baby's wrist, not primarily because it was pretty, though it usually was, but because she genuinely believed it offered the child some measure of safety against illness or misfortune. Decoration and belief, in this world, were rarely fully separate categories. Back near the edge of the market, a craftsman is working at a small stall, and it is worth stopping to watch him for a moment, because Egyptian craftsmanship, at every level of society, tended to carry a level of care that can be genuinely startling once you look closely at surviving objects. This particular man works with faience, shaping small beads and amulets from a paste made of crushed quartz, mixed with a binding agent and a coloring mineral, most often copper, which produces that distinctive brilliant blue-green that shows up across thousands of years of Egyptian material culture. The pieces are shaped by hand or pressed into small molds, then fired in a kiln at a carefully controlled temperature, a process that required real technical knowledge passed down, most likely from parent to child or master to apprentice, the exact recipes sometimes closely guarded within particular workshops or families. There is a rhythm to watching a skilled craftsman at work that has not changed much across the centuries. The particular quality of attention in the hands, the small pause before a delicate final touch, the quiet satisfaction visible on the face of someone doing something they have done many thousands of times and have genuinely gotten very good at. Carpenters worked nearby with imported wood, since Egypt itself had relatively little good timber, most native trees producing wood too soft or twisted for fine furniture, meaning that better wood, cedar in particular, had to be brought in through trade from the region of modern-day Lebanon, a fact that made good furniture a real marker of wealth. Poorer households made do with simpler local woods, sycamore and acacia, serviceable but less prized, and mud brick platforms built directly into the house itself, often served as the closest thing to a bed frame that most families would ever own. Down at the riverbank again, past where Nakht and Pentu have already pushed their small boat out into the current, a larger vessel is being loaded for a journey north toward one of the larger towns a few days' travel downstream. This is a trading boat, wider and sturdier than the little papyrus skiffs used for fishing close to shore, built from planks of imported wood lashed and pegged together in a style that had been refined over an enormous span of time. The Nile functioned, for the entire length of Egyptian history, as something close to a highway, the easiest and often the only practical way to move goods and people across long distances in a country that was, geographically, an extremely narrow ribbon of fertile land hemmed in by desert on both sides. Almost everyone in Egypt lived within a short walk of the river, and almost everything that moved any real distance moved by water. The boat being loaded this morning carries jars of grain, bundles of linen, and a stack of pottery wrapped carefully in reed matting to keep it from shattering against the wooden hull, and the man overseeing the loading, a merchant named Renzi, keeps a careful mental tally of everything going aboard, since a miscount here could mean real financial trouble further down the line. Egyptian sailors had learnt, centuries before this particular morning, to take advantage of one of the more convenient quirks of their geography, which is that the Nile's current flows steadily north, while the prevailing wind blows just as steadily south. Sailing north, then, meant simply letting the current carry the boat while doing very little work at all, and sailing south meant raising a sail and letting the wind do the work instead, oars used only when the wind failed or when manoeuvring was needed close to shore. It is a small piece of geographic luck that shaped an entire civilization's relationship with travel and trade, and I think it is worth pausing on. How much of what a culture becomes is quietly steered by facts of geography that no one involved ever chose or earned, simply inherited. A little further along the bank, past the loading boat, there is a garden, modest by the standards of the wealthy estates you might picture from tomb paintings, but a garden all the same, belonging to a household slightly better off than most in the village, tended mostly by the family's older daughter, a young woman named Nofret. Egyptian gardens, even small ones, tended to be organized with real intention, a mix of practical plants and ones grown simply for their beauty or their shade. Date palms and sycamore fig trees provided both fruit and welcome shadow in a landscape that offered precious little natural shade otherwise, and beneath them smaller plots held onions, garlic, lettuce and herbs, along with flowers, particularly the blue lotus, which held genuine religious and symbolic significance beyond its simple prettiness, associated with rebirth and the rising sun because of the way its blossoms opened each morning and closed again at dusk. Nofret waters the garden by hand this morning, carrying water up from the river in a pair of pottery jars balanced on a wooden yoke across her shoulders, a task that would be repeated in some form in nearly every household along the Nile, since irrigation on any real scale relied heavily on human effort and simple technology rather than anything automated. A device called the shadoof, a long pole balanced on a pivot with a weight on one end and a bucket on the other, made lifting water up from the river considerably easier than carrying it by hand alone, and though it had not yet spread to every household by this point in Egyptian history, in the households and fields where it was used, it represented a genuinely significant improvement in the sheer physical labor of daily irrigation. Watching a shadoof in steady rhythmic use, up and down, has a kind of hypnotic quality to it, the sort of repetitive human motion that, once you really look at it, seems almost meditative rather than merely laborious. Back inside the village proper, the morning meal is being eaten in most households now, and it is worth pausing on what that actually looked like, because it tends to surprise people how modest, how plant-forward, and how genuinely wholesome the everyday Egyptian diet actually was. Bread and beer formed the foundation of nearly every meal, joined by vegetables, onions and leeks especially, which show up constantly in surviving records, and were apparently beloved widely enough that later Roman writers, somewhat mockingly, commented on the Egyptian devotion to onions specifically. Fruit, when in season, dates and figs and grapes, along with legumes, particularly lentils and chickpeas, rounded out a diet that for most ordinary households included meat only occasionally, on festival days, or when a family was wealthy enough to afford it more regularly. Fish, on the other hand, being right there in the river, was a much more constant part of the diet for most people, salted, dried, or eaten fresh depending on the season and the catch. There is a small detail here I find genuinely touching. which is that meals in Egyptian households were, by every indication we have, warm social occasions, eaten together as a family, seated on low stools or simply on mats on the floor, sharing food from communal dishes rather than individual plates in the way we might picture today. Children ate alongside adults, not separately, and there was no elaborate table setting to manage, no formal etiquette beyond basic courtesy, just a family gathered close together at the start and the close of each day, eating bread still warm from the oven, passing a shared jar of beer, talking about whatever a family talks about at the end of an ordinary day. It is such a small, human image, and it has not really changed all that much, has it, across 4,000 years? Children in the village, once the morning's chores are handled, do get real stretches of time simply to be children, and it is worth spending a little while here, because this part of ancient Egyptian life tends to get overlooked entirely in favor of the more famous, more solemn aspects of the culture. Pentu, once he and his father have finished the morning's fishing and hauled the catch back up to the drying racks, is free for a stretch of the afternoon, and he spends part of it with a small group of other children from nearby houses, playing a game involving a leather ball stuffed tightly with straw, tossed and caught in a kind of loose, evolving contest that shifts its own rules depending on how many children happen to be playing that day. Wall paintings and small carved objects from across Egyptian history show children, and sometimes adults too, playing at wrestling, at a kind of tug-of-war, at games involving throwing sticks at a target, and one particularly charming game, reconstructed by historians from surviving depictions, where children would form a circle and try to keep a ball moving between them without letting it touch the ground. Not entirely unlike a game you might see children playing in a park today, board games held a real and serious place in Egyptian leisure as well, crossing every level of society. The most famous of these, senet, was played on a long rectangular board divided into 30 squares, using carved pieces moved according to the throw of small flat sticks or bones that functioned something like dice. Senet boards have been found in the tombs of the wealthy, sometimes quite elaborately carved, but simpler versions, boards scratched directly into stone or wood, have also been found in more modest contexts, suggesting the game was played across the full range of Egyptian society, not reserved for the rich alone. There was something genuinely spiritual layered into the game as well, at least by later periods, senet coming to be associated symbolically with a person's journey through the afterlife. The board itself sometimes treated almost as a small ritual object as much as a source of entertainment, though I suspect that on most ordinary evenings, in most ordinary households, it was simply what it looks like, a pleasant way to pass an hour with someone you liked spending time with. Learning, for children in a village like this, happened mostly through direct apprenticeship rather than formal schooling, at least for the majority of the population who were not destined for careers as scribes or officials. A boy would typically learn his father's trade by watching and gradually helping, the way Pentu is learning fishing from Nakt, or the way a young craftsman's son would spend years absorbing the details of his father's particular skill simply by being present in the workshop, handed smaller and smaller tasks as his competence grew. Girls, similarly, learned household management, weaving, cooking, and the raising of children largely from their mothers and older female relatives, an education built entirely on proximity and repetition rather than formal instruction. Formal education, reading and writing in particular, was reserved for a relatively small portion of the population, mostly boys from families who could either afford it or who had some connection to the scribal profession, since literacy in ancient Egypt meant mastering a genuinely difficult writing system, hieroglyphic for formal and monumental use, and a faster, more practical cursive script called hieratic for everyday administrative and personal writing. Scribal students, and there is real surviving evidence of this, copied out standard texts again and again as part of their training, some of which have survived precisely because student copies, full of small errors and corrections, were later reused or discarded, and ended up preserved in rubbish heaps the way so much of what we know about ordinary Egyptian life has been preserved. One surviving fragment shows a frustrated instructor's note in the margin, something close in spirit to a modern teacher writing "See me after class." and there is a very particular pleasure in realizing that the exasperation of a teacher correcting a student's sloppy handwriting is one of the more perfectly preserved emotions to survive across 4,000 years. Most people, though, the overwhelming majority of the population, never learned to read or write at all, and this did not mean they were considered lesser or lacking in intelligence, simply that their knowledge lived in a different form. In the hands, in memory, in stories passed down aloud rather than committed to papyrus. There is a real dignity in that kind of knowledge too, the kind that a fisherman carries about the exact behavior of a river, or that a weaver carries in her fingers about the precise tension a thread needs before it will hold, none of which required a single written word to be mastered completely and passed on faithfully to the next generation. Marriage and family life in this village followed patterns that would feel, in some ways, both familiar and quite different from what we might expect. Marriage itself was a relatively informal affair by later historical standards, with no elaborate religious ceremony required in the way we might picture from other ancient cultures. A couple was considered married largely once they began living together and establishing a shared household, sometimes marked by a small family gathering or celebration, but without a mandatory religious or state ritual binding it. Marriage contracts did exist, particularly among families with property or wealth worth protecting, carefully outlining what belonged to each party and what would happen to that property in the event of a divorce, and divorce itself, remarkably for such an ancient culture, was reasonably accessible to both men and women, without the severe social stigma that would attach to it in many later societies. Egyptian women, in fact, held a genuinely notable degree of legal independence for the ancient world, able to own property in their own name, to enter into contracts, to initiate legal proceedings, to inherit and to bequeath property largely on the same terms as men. This does not mean Egyptian society was equal in the way we would use that word today. Public office and most formal positions of authority remained overwhelmingly male, but within the household, and within the basic legal architecture of daily life, a woman like Merit or Iset had a genuine measure of control over her own economic circumstances that would have astonished a woman living in many other parts of the ancient world at the same moment in history. Midday, in a village like this, brings its own particular quiet, a stretch of hours when the sun sits high and heavy, and even the animals seem to give up on movement for a while. Most outdoor work slows or stops entirely during these hours, not out of laziness but out of a hard-learned respect for what the heat could do to a body that pushed through it carelessly. Nakat and Pentu have long since brought the morning's catch home, and the fish now sits drying on its racks in the sun, turning slowly darker and firmer over the following days. Senbi and the other farmers have retreated indoors or into whatever shade a courtyard wall can offer, resting through the worst of the heat before returning to the fields in the softer light of late afternoon. This daily rhythm, work concentrated into the cooler edges of the day and rest folded into the middle, shaped nearly every aspect of Egyptian domestic architecture and daily scheduling, and it is a pattern you can still find today, largely unchanged, in parts of the world that share this same relentless midday sun. Inside Merit's house during this quiet stretch, there is time for smaller, gentler tasks. She sits with a basket of flax fibre, spinning it into thread using a simple hand spindle, a weighted stick that she sets spinning with a practiced flick of the wrist, and lets dangle from a length of fibre, drawing the thread out steadily as the spindle turns. It is slow, repetitive work, the kind that leaves the mind free to wander even while the hands stay busy, and Tabiri sits nearby, half watching, half playing with a small carved wooden cat, one of those toys with a hinged jaw that can be made to open and close by pulling a small string, a genuinely delightful little object that has survived in several examples from Egyptian archaeological sites, and always makes me smile. The idea of a child 4,000 years ago finding the exact same simple pleasure in a toy that clicks and moves that a child might find in one today. The household tools scattered around Merit's home tell their own quiet story about how a life like this actually functioned day to day. Pottery, made from Nile clay, formed the backbone of nearly every household task. Large storage jars for grain and water, smaller vessels for cooking and serving, and these were produced in enormous quantities by potters working with a simple turning wheel. the clay-shaped, dried and fired in kilns that dotted the edges of most sizable settlements. Cooking itself happened over an open fire or in the same kind of domed oven used for bread, using pots that could withstand direct heat, and a household's collection of cookware, however modest, represented real accumulated value, repaired and mended rather than casually replaced when something cracked or chipped. Furniture, as mentioned earlier, was sparse in most households compared to what wealthier Egyptians enjoyed, but it was not entirely absent. Low stools, sometimes with woven rush seats, provided the main seating in most homes, and simple wooden chests held clothing, linens, and whatever small valuables a family possessed, since built-in storage of the kind we take for granted today simply did not exist in mud-brick homes like these. Headrests, curved wooden or stone supports used instead of pillows, are one of the more distinctive pieces of Egyptian household furniture, and though they look, to modern eyes, almost aggressively uncomfortable, they were used across every level of society, from the simplest wooden versions in a farmer's home to elaborately carved and even gilded examples belonging to the wealthy. The logic behind them made real sense in this climate, keeping the head elevated and away from the packed earth floor, away from insects, and cooler than a head resting directly against a heat-retaining surface through the long warm nights. Religion, as we touched on earlier with Iset's household shrine, continued to weave itself through the texture of an ordinary afternoon in ways that rarely looked like formal worship in the way we might picture it. A woman passing a small wayside shrine on the edge of the village might pause for a moment to leave a small offering or murmur a brief request, not as part of any scheduled ritual, but simply as part of moving through her day, the way someone today might glance at a photograph on a mantelpiece while walking past it. Certain days of the month were considered luckier or unluckier than others, based on complex calendars maintained by temple priests, but filtering down into common practice, so that a farmer might choose to avoid starting an important task on a day considered unfavorable, not out of deep religious conviction necessarily, simply out of the same instinct that makes a person today avoid scheduling something important on a date that feels, for whatever half-examined reason, slightly unlucky. Magic and medicine, too, were not fully separate categories in this world, and a household like Meret's would likely have kept a small collection of remedies passed down through the family, combining what we would now recognize as genuine practical medicine, certain herbs known to reduce fever, honey used for its real antibacterial properties on wounds, with what we would now call folk magic, small spoken charms recited alongside the physical treatment, believed to be just as essential to the cure as the herb or the honey itself. A trained physician, and Egypt did have genuinely skilled medical practitioners, some specializing narrowly enough that ancient sources mention doctors who treated only the eyes or only the stomach, would often use both approaches simultaneously without seeing any contradiction between them, a physical remedy and a spoken incantation working together in their understanding toward the same end. As the worst of the afternoon heat begins to loosen its grip, music starts to drift through parts of the village, the way it tends to at this particular hour in places where people live close together and the day is winding down toward something more social. A woman a few houses down from Meret's plays a simple reed flute, an instrument that shows up constantly in Egyptian art, in the hands of both professional musicians and ordinary people simply enjoying themselves, and nearby, someone else keeps a loose rhythm on a small hand drum. Egyptian music, as far as we can reconstruct it from paintings, instruments, and occasional written references, covered a genuinely wide emotional range, from lively dance music played at festivals to something quieter and more contemplative for an ordinary evening, and singing accompanied nearly all of it, since instruments alone were rarely the whole performance. Musicians in ancient Egypt occupied an interesting social position, sometimes attached formally to temples or wealthy households, other times simply itinerant performers moving between villages, welcomed for an evening in exchange for food and lodging, their arrival treated as a small, looked-forward-to event. There is something worth noticing in how central music and dance were considered to religious and festival life specifically. Temple ceremonies regularly incorporated musicians and dancers as an essential part of honoring the gods, not as decoration around the edges of worship, but as a genuine component of it. The idea being apparently, that the gods themselves took pleasure in music and rhythm and movement, and that offering it up was a meaningful form of devotion in its own right. Instruments varied considerably by wealth and occasion. Simple percussion, hand clapping, small drums, and rhythmic sticks knocked together formed the backbone of music in most ordinary households, while wealthier settings might include harps, sometimes quite large and elaborately decorated, and a kind of double reed instrument that produced a sound somewhere between an oboe and something more nasal and insistent, an acquired taste. By most modern accounts of similar surviving instrument types, but clearly a beloved and central part of Egyptian musical life for an extraordinarily long stretch of history. The Egyptian year, beyond the three broad agricultural seasons already mentioned, was punctuated by festivals throughout, and these represented genuine breaks from ordinary labor, real occasions of collective celebration that most people in a village would have looked forward to with real anticipation. Some festivals were purely local, tied to a particular regional deity or a specific temple's calendar, while others were observed, in some form, across the whole of Egypt. Food during festival time tended to be richer and more abundant than ordinary daily fare, meat appearing on the table more regularly during these stretches than during ordinary weeks, and beer flowed more freely, sometimes to a degree that surviving texts describe with a kind of wry, knowing humor. Festival drunkenness apparently being neither uncommon nor especially scandalous within reason. One of the larger and more widely celebrated festivals involved a ritual procession in which a sacred image of a particular god was carried from its temple, often by boat along the river itself, to visit another temple or shrine some distance away, and ordinary villagers would line the riverbanks to watch the procession pass, treating it as much as a social occasion, a chance to see neighbors from further along the river and catch up on news, as a purely religious event. Merit and her family, on the occasion of one such festival earlier in the year, walked a fair distance along the riverbank with several neighboring families to watch exactly this kind of procession pass. Tabari perched on her father's shoulders for a better view, and the memory of that day, the noise of the crowd, the particular golden quality of the light on the water that afternoon, the taste of a sweet cake made specially for the occasion, is the kind of small, warm memory that a family carries forward long after the specific religious significance of the festival itself has faded a little from daily thought. Seasonal life along the Nile, beyond the festivals, followed its own deep and steady rhythm that governed nearly everything about how a year felt, from the anxious watching of the flood's arrival in late summer, when villagers would gather at the riverbank each morning to check how high the water had risen overnight against markers carved into the stone, to the burst of intense labor during planting season once the water receded, to the long, hot, demanding weeks of the harvest, when entire families, children included, would be out in the fields from the earliest hours of daylight, cutting grain by hand with simple curved sickles, and gathering it into bundles to be threshed and stored before the next flood arrived to begin the whole cycle over again. There was real vulnerability woven through this rhythm. A bad flood, too high or too low, could mean genuine hardship for an entire region, and yet there was also, running underneath that vulnerability, a kind of deep, practiced confidence built from countless generations of families who had watched this same river rise and fall and had, more often than not, come through it intact. As the sun begins its long, slow slide toward the western horizon, the light along the Nile changes in a way that is hard to describe without sounding a little sentimental about it, but I am going to try anyway, because it matters to the feeling of this whole world. The harsh white glare of midday softens into something warmer, more golden, and shadows that had shrunk to almost nothing under the noon sun begin to stretch out long and soft across the packed earth paths between houses. This is when the village properly wakes back up from its afternoon quiet, work resuming in the fields, the market beginning to pack away for the day, children who had been dozing through the heat suddenly full of renewed energy for one last stretch of play before dinner. Senbi is back out in his field, and this particular stretch of the agricultural calendar has him focused on irrigation channels, small trenches dug by hand to guide water from the main flow of a canal into the specific rows where his crops are growing. This work, unglamorous as it sounds, represented one of the genuine intellectual achievements of Egyptian civilization, a whole system of canals and channels, maintained and extended generation after generation, that allowed farmers to extend the reach of the flood's benefit well beyond what the river alone would naturally cover. Maintaining these channels required real cooperation between neighboring farmers, since a channel serving one man's field often ran directly through or alongside his neighbors, and disputes over water rights, over who was entitled to how much and when, were common enough that they show up regularly in surviving legal records, adjudicated by local officials whose job included exactly this kind of everyday arbitration. A short distance from Senby's field, a small group of men are working with mud brick. And it is worth pausing here, because building in this world, ordinary building, the kind that put a roof over a farmer's family rather than a pharaoh's tomb, was itself a genuine craft with its own accumulated body of knowledge. Bricks were made by mixing Nile mud with straw, which helped bind the mixture and reduce cracking as it dried, pressed into simple wooden molds, and left in the sun to harden over several days, rather than being fired in a kiln the way finer pottery was. This meant mud brick construction was relatively fast and required no specialized fuel, an important consideration in a landscape with limited timber for burning. But it also meant these buildings required regular maintenance, a fresh coat of mud plaster every so often to smooth over cracks and repair the erosion caused by wind and the rare but real threat of heavy rain. There is something worth sitting with here. This whole civilization, so famous for structures built to last essentially forever, built the actual homes its people lived and died in from a material that required constant, patient renewal. The eternal and the ephemeral existing side by side, the temple built to outlast time itself standing not far from a farmer's house that would need a fresh coat of mud plaster within a year or two just to keep standing. I do not think the Egyptians themselves experienced this as any kind of contradiction. It was simply the shape of their world, some things built for eternity, other things built for a good, ordinary, sufficient life, and both mattered in their own way. Back near the market, which is beginning to thin out as vendors pack away unsold goods for the evening, a scribe sits at a small folding stool with a papyrus scroll balanced across his knees, and this is worth a moment of real attention, because the profession of scribe occupied a genuinely privileged and respected position in Egyptian society, one of the relatively few paths available to a boy from an ordinary family to rise into a more comfortable and secure life through education rather than inherited wealth or land. This particular scribe, a young man not much older than 20, is recording a transaction on behalf of a local official, tallying grain deliveries against expected tax obligations. Since taxation in Egypt was assessed largely in kind, a portion of a farmer's harvest owed to the state rather than a payment of coined money, and someone needed to keep careful, accurate written records of exactly how much each household owed and had already delivered. Scribal training, as touched on earlier, was long and demanding, typically beginning in a boy's early years and continuing for a decade or more, and surviving texts used in scribal education include, somewhat amusingly, passages praising the scribal profession specifically by comparing it, in vivid and slightly exaggerated terms, to the much harder physical labor endured by farmers, soldiers, and craftsmen, essentially an ancient version of a parent telling a child to study hard so they will not have to work as difficult a job as someone else does. There is something charming in recognizing that particular parental argument as being apparently thousands of years old and still being made in more or less the same form today, not far from the scribe. An older woman sits weaving on a horizontal ground loom, the kind that required her to sit low, legs extended, the warp threads stretched taut in front of her between two wooden beams pegged into the earth. Her name is Hunero, and she has been weaving for longer than most of the adults in the village have been alive, her hands moving through the motions with a kind of unconscious fluency that comes only from decades of repetition, passing the shuttle back and forth, beating each new row of weft threads firmly into place with a flat wooden tool worn smooth from years of exactly this use. Weaving in Egyptian households was almost entirely women's work, and it represented one of the more economically significant contributions a woman could make to her family's well-being, since finished linen cloth was valuable enough to function as a genuine form of currency in the barter economy, traded for grain, for oil, for whatever else a household needed but did not produce itself. Hunero is not weaving for her own household this afternoon. She weaves, several days a week, for a wealthier family on the far side of the village, paid in a combination of grain and a small share of the finished cloth itself, and this arrangement, a skilled woman essentially working as an independent contractor for households that needed more cloth than they could produce themselves, was common enough across ancient Egypt that it represents a real and often overlooked category of female economic activity, women who are neither simply wives managing their own households nor formally employed by the state or a temple, but something closer to independent craftswomen, trading a valuable skill for goods and security. There is a small tangent worth taking here, because it connects back to something we touched on earlier with Nofret and her garden. Egyptian women of this era, across a wide range of social classes, appear again and again in surviving records as economic actors in their own right, buying and selling property, lending grain, entering into legal disputes over inheritance and debt, with the same standing as men bringing similar cases. A court document survives, from a period not too distant from this particular afternoon in this particular village, recording a woman who successfully sued a neighbor over a boundary dispute involving a small parcel of inherited land, arguing her case apparently with enough clarity and evidence that the ruling went entirely in her favor. It is a small thing, a single surviving fragment of an ordinary legal dispute, and yet it tells you something real and specific about how a woman like Hunero or Meret or Iset understood her own place in this world, not as a passive figure moved around by the decisions of men, but as someone with genuine standing, genuine voice, genuine recourse when something needed defending. As the afternoon eases further toward evening, Nakt's boat comes back into view around the bend in the river, this time not for fishing, but simply returning from a short errand upstream, delivering a portion of dried fish to a household that had traded for it earlier in the week. This is a good moment to notice something about scale, about how small this whole world actually was, in terms of the distances most people traveled across an entire lifetime. Most ordinary Egyptians, farmers and fishermen and craftsmen alike, spent the overwhelming majority of their lives within a fairly modest radius of the place they were born, the river itself providing the main avenue for any longer journeys that did happen, whether for trade, for a festival at a more distant temple, or for the relatively rare occasion of visiting family who had settled elsewhere along the Nile's long course. And yet within that modest radius, life was not narrow or small in feeling, not from the inside of it. A village like this one contained, within its own boundaries, an entire functioning world, farming and fishing and craft and trade and religion and family and music and grief and celebration, everything a human life actually needs, present and accounted for, without requiring travel to a great city or a grand temple to feel complete. I think there is something worth carrying forward from that, something that applies just as well now as it did then, the idea that a full life does not require a large one, that depth and richness can exist entirely within a small, familiar radius of home. There is an elderly man who lives near the edge of the village, close enough to the fields that he can still watch the work happen without being expected to join it anymore. And his name is A, and he holds a position in this small community that does not have a formal title but is understood by everyone all the same. A is the one who remembers things, not officially, not as any kind of appointed role, simply because he has lived longer than almost anyone else in the village, and has, over the decades, become the person people go to when they want to know how something was done before, or why a particular custom exists, or what happened the year the flood came in dangerously low and the whole village had to lean on stored grain and careful rationing to make it through to the next harvest. In the evenings especially, children tend to gather near wherever I happens to be sitting, drawn by the promise of a story, and this evening is no exception. As the light finally starts to fail properly, the golden hour giving way to a deeper blue that seems to rise up out of the ground itself rather than descend from the sky, Pentu and Tabari and a handful of other children settle onto mats near I's doorway, and he begins, unhurried, the way a person tells a story when they have told it many times before and know exactly which details make children lean in closer. Egyptian oral tradition, running alongside and underneath the more formal written mythology preserved in temple texts, would have included exactly this kind of storytelling, tales of gods and clever animals and moral lessons wrapped in narrative, passed down not through any centralized authority, but through countless evenings just like this one, an old man or woman with a good memory and a gift for pacing, an audience of children willing to sit still a little longer than usual because the story was good enough to earn it. Some of what I tells tonight touches on the great cosmic myths, the story of how the sun god traveled through the underworld each night to be reborn each morning, a story that gave shape and meaning to something as simple and universal as watching the sun set and trusting, with real faith, that it would rise again. Other parts of what he tells are smaller, stranger, more local, stories about a particular bend in the river, about a spirit said to live in an old sycamore tree at the edge of the fields, the kind of story that exists only here, known only to this specific handful of families, never written down anywhere, surviving purely because it gets told again, faithfully, each generation to the next. I find something quietly moving in how certain we can still be, so long afterward, that this kind of evening happened, over and over, for thousands of years. Even though we can never know the specific words A might have used, the specific stories that belonged only to this one small stretch of riverbank, so much of what made up the actual emotional texture of ancient Egyptian life existed exactly here, in evenings like this one, and left behind no trace at all except the simple, powerful fact of its happening. Inside the houses now, as full darkness settles properly over the village, small clay lamps are being lit, simple shallow bowls filled with oil, most commonly castor oil, though sesame and other oils were used depending on what was available and affordable, with a twisted linen wick floating at the rim, providing a small, warm, flickering circle of light against the deepening dark. These oil lamps were not bright by any modern standard, nothing close to what we are used to, casting instead a soft, low, golden pool of light that barely reached the corners of a room. And there is something worth noticing in how differently a household must have experienced its own evenings under that kind of light compared to the harsh, even brightness we take entirely for granted now. Shadows would have moved and flickered constantly against mud brick walls, faces lit from below in a way that made expressions read differently than they do in daylight, and the small radius of usable light around each lamp would have naturally drawn a family physically closer together in the evening, gathered within that shared circle of warmth, rather than spread out through a house the way electric light allows a modern family to scatter into separate, individually lit rooms. Merritt and her family are settling into exactly this kind of evening now. The day's work fully finished, a simple meal of bread and dried fish and beer, shared quietly by lamplight. Tabby already beginning to fight off sleep despite her best efforts to stay awake a little longer, caught somewhere between the pull of exhaustion and the reluctance every child feels at the idea of a good day actually ending. This is one of those moments that has genuinely not changed very much at all across the whole enormous span of human history. A family gathered close in low light at the end of a working day, the youngest one losing a quiet, familiar battle against sleep, the adults talking in low, unhurried voices about small, ordinary things, tomorrow's tasks, a piece of news from the market, nothing especially important, everything, in its own quiet way, essential. Sleep itself, in this world, looked and felt different from what we know now, and it is worth spending real time here, since this is, after all, where we are slowly headed together tonight as well. Most people in a village like this slept on simple woven mats laid over a low mud brick platform built directly into the sleeping room, or, during the hottest stretches of summer, up on the flat roof of the house, where whatever breeze existed had a better chance of reaching a tired body than it did down at ground level, trapped within thick mud brick walls. Sleeping outdoors under open sky, under a genuinely dark, star-filled sky with none of the light pollution that erases so much of the night for so many of us now, must have been its own particular pleasure, however ordinary and unremarkable it felt to the people actually doing it night after night. The wooden or stone headrests we touched on earlier were used instead of pillows in the way we would think of them, curved to cradle the base of the skull just behind the ear, propped on a small support that lifted the head a modest but meaningful distance off the sleeping mat. It sounds, described plainly like that, like it would be nearly impossible to actually rest on, and yet these headrests were used across the entire span of Egyptian history by rich and poor alike, which tells you something real, that the body adapts, given enough time and enough generations of habit, to forms of comfort that would strike an outsider as strange or even faintly uncomfortable. Some surviving examples are inscribed with small protective texts or images of the household god Bez, the same squat, friendly-faced protector we met earlier watching over Iset's home shrine, because a headrest cradling a sleeping head was understood to be exactly the kind of vulnerable, undefended moment that needed a little extra spiritual protection. Sleep itself considered a small nightly journey into a state not entirely unlike death, one from which a person needed, and generally received, safe passage back into morning. Dreams held real significance in Egyptian thought, taken seriously as potential messages, warnings, or visitations rather than dismissed as meaningless mental noise, the way a great deal of modern culture tends to treat them. There were even specialists, dream interpreters, consulted by people troubled or intrigued by a particularly vivid or unsettling dream, and surviving papyri include what amount to early dream dictionaries, long lists pairing specific dream images with their believed meanings. A person who dreamed of a particular animal or event advised on whether the dream suggested good fortune ahead or a need for caution. I find something quietly comforting in the idea that this same private, strange, occasionally troubling experience we all still have, waking in the middle of the night turning over the pieces of some vivid, half-remembered dream, was taken seriously enough this far back that someone thought it worth writing down entire systems for understanding it. The sounds of a village at night were their own particular texture, different from daytime but never fully silent. Somewhere a dog settles with a final huff into a favoured sleeping spot near a doorway. Insects keep up a steady low hum from the direction of the fields, joined occasionally by the deeper croaking chorus of frogs down near the water's edge. Very faintly, if the wind sits right, you might catch the sound of the river itself, that low, continuous, endlessly patient sound of moving water that had accompanied every single night of every single person who had ever lived in this village, going back generations further than anyone could actually trace, and above all of it, unobstructed by any artificial light for 100 miles in any direction, a genuinely staggering spread of stars. The same stars, more or less, that mattered so deeply to Egyptian religious and calendrical thought, the star Sirius in particular, whose annual reappearance in the dawn sky, after weeks of being hidden from view, was watched for with real anticipation, because its return reliably coincided with the coming rise of the Nile flood, one more small, quiet piece of evidence that this entire civilization had learned, patiently, over an enormous span of time, to read its own survival written plainly across the night sky. There were priests in Egypt, of course, and temples, grand and famous ones in the larger cities, but it is worth remembering that even temple life, at the level of most ordinary temple staff, rather than the small number of high-ranking officials at the very top, functioned as a genuine and fairly ordinary profession, rotating in shifts, many priests serving only part of the year while maintaining farms or trades the rest of the time, returning to duties not unlike senbis for a portion of each year before their turn came to serve at the temple again. Temples also functioned as major economic institutions in their own right, owning land, employing craftsmen, brewers, bakers, weavers, on a scale large enough that a temple complex could function almost like a small, self-contained town, and a fair number of ordinary villagers throughout Egypt would have had some connection to temple employment at one point or another in their working lives, delivering goods, providing labor during a particular festival, or working a rotation of service duty that was considered, much like taxation, simply one more obligation woven into the expected shape of an ordinary year. Let us drift back a little, before we settle fully into the night, to something we passed over earlier in the day, because it deserves its own quiet attention. Not far from the village, where the cultivated fields give way to marshland along a slower, shallower stretch of the river, a different kind of daily life unfolds entirely, one built around reeds and waterfowl rather than grain and livestock. A man named Amenhotep, no relation to any king who shared his fairly common name, spends much of his day out among the tall papyrus reeds in a small skiff, hunting waterfowl with a curved wooden throwing stick, a weapon that looks almost like a boomerang, and when thrown well, could strike down a bird in flight with real accuracy. Egyptian marsh scenes appear again and again in tomb paintings, precisely because this environment, alive with birds and fish and the particular green-gold light that filters down through papyrus stands, held a real and lasting place in the Egyptian imagination, associated with abundance, with the fertile edge between land and water, where life seemed to gather most thickly. Papyrus itself, harvested from these same marshes, served a purpose far beyond the writing material most people associate the word with today. The thick, fibrous stalks were used to make rope, sandals, small boats like the ones Nakt uses each morning, baskets and matting, an almost endlessly versatile plant that grew abundantly and cost nothing but labor to harvest and process. The pith of the stalk, sliced into thin strips, laid in overlapping layers at right angles to each other, and pressed under weight until the plant's own natural sap bonded the layers together, produced the writing material that would eventually carry Egyptian administration, literature, and religious text across thousands of years, a genuinely remarkable technology that Egypt more or less held a monopoly on for a long stretch of the ancient world, exporting finished papyrus scrolls to other cultures who lacked access to the plant in the quantities Egypt enjoyed along its own riverbanks. Cattle graze in a modest herd not far from Senbi's fields, tended by a young relative of his, a boy slightly older than Pentu, and cattle held a particular kind of prestige in Egyptian rural life beyond their practical value for milk, meat on special occasions, and labor pulling plows through the softened post-flood soil. A household's wealth, in the countryside especially, was often measured quite directly in the number and health of the cattle it owned, and there are surviving records of careful cattle counts conducted periodically by officials, part census, part tax assessment, treating livestock as a genuine and closely tracked form of national wealth. Goats and pigs, more modest and more universally affordable, rounded out the livestock of most ordinary households, along with ducks and geese kept close to home, their eggs and eventually their meat, providing a steadier, more reliable source of protein than the occasional luxury of beef. Trade brought goods into this world from genuinely distant places, and it is worth remembering that ancient Egypt, for all its geographic isolation, wedged as it was between two harsh deserts, was never truly cut off from the wider world around it. Turquoise and copper came up from mining expeditions into the Sinai Peninsula. Cedarwood, as mentioned earlier, arrived by ship from the coast of the region we now call Lebanon. Gold came from mines in the eastern desert and from Nubia to the south, a region with which Egypt maintained a long, complicated relationship of trade, cultural exchange, and periodic conflict across its history. Incense and exotic goods, ebony, ivory, live animals for royal menageries, came up the Nile from further south still, through trade networks that stretched, link by link, hand by hand, deep into the African interior. A merchant like Renzi, whom we met earlier loading his boat, would occasionally deal in goods that had passed through several intermediary hands before ever reaching his own, each transaction adding its own small markup, each trader along the chain making his own modest, ordinary living off the movement of goods that had started their journey unimaginably far from this particular bend in the river. I want to sit, just for a moment, with how much genuine cosmopolitan reach existed inside a civilization that people sometimes imagine as isolated and insular, sealed off behind its deserts. Nubian soldiers and traders lived and worked within Egyptian communities. Syrian and Levantine merchants brought goods and, inevitably, stories and customs from their own distant homes. Egypt absorbed influences the way any long-lived, geographically connected civilization does, quietly, unevenly, over centuries, until certain foreign customs or goods simply became Egyptian customs and Egyptian goods, their origins forgotten by everyone except, perhaps, a scribe somewhere with a particular interest in old trade records. There is a physician in this village too, or close enough to it, a woman named Peseshet who splits her time between healing work and a small household of her own, and I mention her specifically because women practicing medicine, while less common than men in the surviving record, were genuinely documented in ancient Egypt, one of the more notable examples being a woman who held a title translating roughly to overseer of female physicians, suggesting an entire structured tier of medical practice, specifically involving women treating women, particularly around matters of childbirth and women's health more broadly. Peseshet's knowledge, passed down to her from her own mother, who learned it from a physician she had once assisted, covers a genuinely wide range, from setting broken bones with wooden splints bound in linen to treating wounds with honey and mouldy bread poultices that, as strange as it sounds to modern ears, likely carried real antibacterial properties we would now attribute to naturally occurring antibiotic compounds, to assisting with difficult births, a role that carried enormous weight and responsibility in a world where childbirth remained genuinely dangerous for both mother and child. Egyptian medical knowledge, preserved in surviving papyri, some of them genuinely startling in their sophistication, includes detailed anatomical observations likely gained in part through the practice of mummification itself, which gave certain practitioners an intimate, hands-on familiarity with the internal structure of the human body that few other ancient cultures could claim at a comparable scale. One surviving medical text includes what modern scholars consider a remarkably early and accurate description of the heart's central role in circulating blood throughout the body, described in language that, translated carefully, sounds almost startlingly close to a correct physiological understanding, arrived at, it seems, through careful, patient, repeated observation rather than any single flash of insight. Death itself, and the customs surrounding it, held real importance in this culture, though I want to speak about it gently here, the way I think it deserves, because so much of what survives from ancient Egypt on this particular subject tends to get presented as something grim or elaborate, rather than what it actually was for most ordinary families, which was an expression of love and continuity rather than fear. The Egyptians believed in a concept called the Ka, a kind of life force or spiritual double that accompanied a person through life and needed to be sustained through offerings of food and drink, even after death, which is part of why family members would continue visiting the burial place of a loved one long after the funeral itself, bringing small offerings, speaking quietly to the departed, maintaining a relationship that did not end simply because a body had stopped breathing. For an ordinary family in a village like this one, a proper burial was more modest than the elaborate tombs we associate with royalty, a simple grave in the desert edge beyond the cultivated land, the body prepared as carefully as the family's means allowed, wrapped, accompanied by a few treasured or useful objects, and remembered faithfully in the years that followed. There is something in that continued relationship, that ongoing conversation with the dead, that I find genuinely tender rather than morbid. The idea that love simply continued in a new form, adjusted rather than severed, and that visiting a family grave was less an act of mourning in the way we might picture it, and more a kind of ongoing, patient tending, not unlike watering a garden that a beloved grandmother had planted, keeping something alive that she had started, in her honor, long after she herself was gone. Let us walk back through the village one more time now, slowly, the way you might walk through a sleeping neighborhood late at night when everyone else has already gone to bed, and you are the only one still awake to notice the small details. Merritt's house is quiet now, the oven cold, the last of the evening's lamp allowed to burn down to a small, steady point of orange light in the front room, low enough that it will likely gutter out entirely before anyone wakes to notice. Tabiri lost her battle against sleep some time ago, curled on her mat with the small wooden cat still loosely held in one hand, her breathing slow and even in the particular deep, uncomplicated way that only a child's sleep really achieves. Merritt herself lies nearby, listening for a moment longer to the small ordinary sounds of her own house settling for the night before her own eyes, heavy from a long day's work, finally close as well. Down near the river, nacked small boat sits pulled up onto the bank, tied loosely to a wooden post worn smooth by years of exactly this same rope. Tomorrow morning he will be back down here before the light fully changes, checking the same nets, listening for the same particular whisper of wind through the reeds. But for tonight his part of the day is finished, and inside his own house, not far from Merritt's, Pentu is already deeply asleep, the particular exhaustion of a boy who spent his whole day moving, fishing in the morning, playing in the afternoon, listening to A's stories in the evening, finally catching up with him all at once the moment his head found the curved wooden headrest waiting for him. Sembi and Iset's house holds its own particular quiet now too, the small household shrine in its corner barely visible in the near-total darkness, the day's offering of bread long since eaten by whichever small animal or insect found it first, which never troubled Iset in the slightest, since the gesture of the offering mattered more than what became of it afterward. Senbi's body carries the particular deep, satisfied tiredness of physical labor honestly done, the kind of tiredness that makes sleep come quickly and completely, without the restless circling thoughts that sometimes keep a mind awake long after the body itself is ready to rest. Further along, past the edge of the market that stood so busy and loud just hours earlier, now entirely empty except for a stray dog investigating the last scattered scraps of the day's trade, Hunero has finished her weaving for the day and set the loom carefully aside, the day's woven length of linen rolled and stored safely away from dust and damp until tomorrow's work resumes it exactly where it left off. Renzi's trading boat, loaded and ready, sits moored a little further downstream, waiting for tomorrow's early departure, the goods aboard it carefully covered against the night's dew, a light watch kept by one of the crew, dozing but attentive, the kind of half-sleep that people who spend their lives around valuable cargo learn to master out of simple necessity. Nofret's garden, watered faithfully that morning, sits quiet and dark now too, the blue lotus blossoms we spoke of earlier already closed for the night, waiting, as they always do, for the particular quality of early morning light that will coax them open again tomorrow. That small daily ritual of opening and closing that so many generations of Egyptians found such deep symbolic comfort in, watching a flower perform, every single day without fail, its own small private version of the sun's own rebirth. And out at the edge of the village, where the cultivated land finally gives way to the deep, star-heavy darkness of the desert beyond, I sits a little longer than the others tonight, as older people sometimes do, not quite ready yet to lie down, content instead to simply sit in the particular quiet of a village he has watched grow and change, and largely stay the same across the whole long span of his own life. Above him, and above all of it, the Merits and the Nakts and the Senbis and the Isets, and the whole sleeping, breathing weight of this small, ordinary world, the sky holds itself open in that vast, undimmed way that a truly dark night allows, more stars visible at once than most of us, living now under skies dimmed by our own bright modern lights, will ever have the chance to see in an entire lifetime. I want to go back for a moment, before we drift any further into the night, to something that has been sitting quietly at the edge of nearly every scene we have visited today without ever quite stepping into the light, and that is the cat curled somewhere near Merit's doorway, half asleep, one ear twitching occasionally towards some small sound in the dark beyond the threshold. Cats held a genuinely unique position in Egyptian households, and it is worth being precise about what that actually meant in daily practice, since the popular image of Egyptians worshipping cats tends to flatten something that was, in reality, more affectionate and more practical than purely religious. Cats were valued first, quite simply, for their usefulness, keeping households and, above all, grain stores free of the mice and rats that would otherwise have eaten through a family's entire stored harvest given the chance. And a good mouser was a genuinely valuable member of any household, farming families especially. But affection followed close behind usefulness, and it followed quickly. Surviving artwork shows cats seated beneath chairs during meals, cats accompanying hunters out into the marshes, cats depicted with real individual character and warmth rather than as generic symbols, and there are records of households in mourning after the death of a beloved cat, some families observing a period of shaved eyebrows as a visible sign of grief, a custom that tells you something real about how deeply a pet could be woven into a family's emotional life. The goddess Bastet, associated with cats and often depicted with a feline head, represented protection, fertility, and the home, and her popularity across ordinary households, not just grand temples, reflects how genuinely central this small, watchful, independent animal had become to the Egyptian idea of a happy, protected home. There is a particular kind of comfort, I think, in imagining a cat curled near a sleeping child's mat 4,000 years ago, doing more or less exactly what a cat does now, indifferent to the passage of centuries, entirely unbothered by questions of civilization or history or meaning, simply warm and present and quietly keeping watch in its own self-interested, endearing way. Let us drift a little further into the shape of an ordinary meal, since we touched on it earlier but did not linger, and lingering on food, on this particular night, feels like exactly the right kind of thing to do. Beyond the daily staples of bread and beer and vegetables, Egyptian cooking, for households who could manage a bit more variety, included a genuinely wide range of flavor, garlic and coriander and cumin used generously, along with fenugreek and dill, herbs grown in household gardens like nofrets or purchased in small quantities at market. Honey served as the primary sweetener, precious and carefully rationed in most households, used to sweeten cakes made for festivals or special occasions, since sugar as we know it today did not exist yet anywhere in the ancient world. Dates, dried and fresh, provided another reliable source of sweetness, eaten on their own or worked into baked goods, and there are surviving recipes, reconstructed by food historians from tomb inscriptions and administrative records, listing ingredients for a kind of early honey cake dense with dates and nuts that would not feel entirely out of place, in spirit if not in exact form, on a dessert table today. Cooking oil came primarily from sesame seeds or from a plant called safflower, pressed by hand using simple wooden presses, and olive oil, though it existed and was known in Egypt, was largely an imported luxury for most of Egyptian history rather than a homegrown staple, since the climate and growing conditions for olives suited the Mediterranean coastline further north far better than they suited the Nile Valley itself. Salt came from natural deposits, some gathered along desert margins where ancient dried lake beds left mineral-rich crusts behind, and was used both for flavoring food and, as mentioned earlier in connection with natron, in various preservation and even purification processes that extended well beyond the kitchen. There is a small workshop at the edge of the village belonging to a sandal maker named Iolot, and though his craft might sound modest compared to some of the trades we have visited today, it deserves its own moment because footwear in Egypt carried more social meaning than you might expect from something so simple. Most ordinary people, most of the time, went barefoot, particularly around the home and in the fields, where sandals would only get in the way of work anyway, and the feet of most working Egyptians, if surviving physical remains are any indication, were toughened by decades of direct contact with hot sand and packed earth in a way that made sandals feel for daily labor more like an unnecessary complication than a comfort. But sandals were worn for travel, for market visits, for festivals, and for anyone whose status required a certain visible dignity. And Iolot's workshop this evening still smells faintly of the papyrus and palm fiber he weaves into the simplest, most affordable style of sandal, alongside a small stock of finer leather versions for customers who can afford the difference. The leather sandals take considerably more skill, cured and cut hide, shaped and stitched by hand, sometimes decorated with simple painted designs, or, for the truly wealthy, inlaid with small amounts of gold. And Iolot learnt this particular craft from his own father, the way nearly every trade in this world passed from one generation to the next, through years of patient, hands-on apprenticeship rather than formal instruction. There is a story, small and a little funny, that Iolot likes to tell about a wealthy customer years earlier who insisted on a pair of sandals decorated with an image of a bound enemy on the sole itself, so that with every step the wearer would symbolically trample his foes underfoot, a genuine and historically documented practice among the wealthy and powerful, and Iolot still shakes his head slightly, half amused, half bemused, at the memory of crafting something so deliberately, elaborately aggressive for a piece of footwear meant simply to walk to market and back, a short distance beyond the village, close enough for an easy walk but far enough to feel like a genuinely different place, sits a modest temple town, home to a local shrine of moderate importance, not one of the great national temples but significant enough regionally to support its own small community of priests, craftsmen and administrators. This is where Renzi will deliver part of his cargo tomorrow, where the scribe we met earlier trained in his early years, and where festivals larger than anything the village itself could host draw crowds from the surrounding countryside several times a year. The temple complex itself, viewed from a distance in the last of the evening light, presents a genuinely striking silhouette against the darkening sky. Tall gateways and columned courtyards rising above the flat rooftops of the ordinary houses clustered around its base, and yet even here, in the shadow of something grand and deliberately imposing, ordinary daily life continues in more or less the same shape it takes everywhere else along the river, families cooking dinner, children playing in narrow lanes, an old woman calling a straying goat back toward home. Timekeeping in this world followed its own particular logic, worth pausing on briefly, since we have spent so much of tonight moving through the hours of a single day without naming how those hours were actually counted. Egyptians divided both day and night into 12 hours each, though these hours were not fixed in length the way ours are, stretching and shrinking instead with the actual changing length of daylight across the seasons, so that an hour in the height of summer daylight ran noticeably longer than an hour in the deep of winter darkness. Shadow clocks, essentially a simple upright piece with a crossbar casting a moving shadow across marked divisions, tracked daytime hours, while nighttime hours were tracked by priests and astronomers through careful, practiced observation of specific stars rising at specific points along the horizon, a system precise enough to regulate temple rituals that needed to happen at exact, specific hours of the night, long before anything resembling a mechanical clock existed anywhere in the world. Writing itself, before we move further into the night, deserves one more small visit, because there is something genuinely lovely hidden inside the practical mechanics of how a scribe actually put words down. Ink came in two basic colors, black made from carbon, typically soot mixed with a binding gum, and red made from ochre, a naturally occurring iron-rich pigment, and a scribe would carry both, usually pressed into small cakes within a compact wooden palette, wetting a reed brush as needed, the way a modern painter might work from a dry watercolor set. Red ink served a specific and rather charming purpose, used to mark the beginning of a new section, a heading, or a particularly important word within a longer passage of black text, an ancient ancestor, in spirit if not in mechanism, of the kind of highlighting or bold text we still use today for exactly the same reason, to help a reader's eye find the important parts more quickly. The reed pens themselves were simple, cut from marsh reeds and trimmed to a fine point, replaced regularly as they wore down from use, and a working scribe would carry a small kit of these tools essentially everywhere, the way a craftsman carries the tools of his particular trade. There is a real pleasure, I think, in imagining the actual physical motion of hieroglyphic writing being produced, not the grand, formal, carved version we usually picture from temple walls, but the fast, practical, slightly loose cursive hieratic script used for everyday letters and records, a scribe's hand moving quickly and fluently across a sheet of papyrus, in a way that looked, to an untrained eye watching over his shoulder, almost like a kind of controlled, purposeful scribble, the true elegant formal hieroglyphs reserved mostly for monuments and formal religious texts, rather than for a farmer's tax receipt or a merchant's shipping list. Amulets, which we touched on earlier in connection with jewelry, deserve one more small visit too, because the sheer variety of protective objects woven into ordinary Egyptian daily life is genuinely remarkable once you start paying attention to it. Beyond the scarab and the ankh and the eye of Horus already mentioned, households kept amulets shaped like specific animals believed to carry particular protective qualities, a frog for fertility and the promise of new life, a lion for strength and protection against danger, a small knot-shaped charm called the tite, closely associated with the goddess Isis, worn especially by women, believed to offer a kind of maternal protection that echoed the goddess's own mythological role as a devoted and resourceful mother. These were not treated as separate from ordinary jewelry, worn instead alongside it, threaded onto the same simple cord or chain as a favorite bead necklace, magic and adornment and personal identity all woven together into the same small object worn against the skin. Donkeys, meanwhile, served as the primary beast of burden across ancient Egypt, since horses, though they did eventually arrive in Egypt and became associated mainly with chariots and the military, were far less commonly used for the everyday hauling and carrying work that fell instead to these smaller, sturdier, more affordable animals. A donkey train, loaded with sacks of grain or jars of oil, moving along a dusty path between village and market, was one of the most ordinary and unremarkable sights imaginable across the whole span of Egyptian history, and the particular stubborn, opinionated character of donkeys, so recognizable to anyone who has spent time around them today, shows up in the record too, in the form of the occasional exasperated administrative complaint about a donkey that had wandered off or simply refused to cooperate with the day's planned work. a small, timeless frustration that any farmer in any century would recognize immediately. There is a potter's workshop on the far side of the village that we have not visited yet tonight, and it belongs to a man named Kai, who works at his wheel most days from just after sunrise until the light fails, shaping the endless stream of jars and bowls and storage vessels that every household in the village and the surrounding countryside depends on for essentially every part of daily life. The Egyptian potter's wheel was a genuinely clever piece of technology for its time, a heavy stone disc set to spin on a simple pivot, kept in motion by a foot or by an assistant, usually a younger family member still learning the trade, while the potter's hands did the actual work of shaping wet clay into whatever form the day's orders required. Kai's youngest son spends most afternoons exactly in that assistant role, keeping the wheel spinning at a steady rhythm, while his father shapes vessel after vessel with a fluency that makes the whole process look, to an outside observer, almost embarrassingly easy, the kind of easy that only exists on the far side of many thousands of hours of practice. Pottery in this world was not decorative in the way we might think of ceramic art today, at least not usually, not for ordinary households. It was infrastructure, the containers that made storage, cooking, and transport of food and liquid possible at all, and a broken jar was a genuine small household crisis, not merely an inconvenience, since replacing it meant either paying Kai for a new one, or, for a family without much to spare, doing without whatever function that jar had served until they could manage the cost. Kai's workshop, this evening, is quiet now too, the wheel still, the day's finished pieces set out to dry slowly and evenly before tomorrow's firing, and there is a particular satisfaction visible in the neat, orderly rows of unfired vessels waiting patiently in the day's last light, the tangible, countable result of an honest day's steady work. The village has a kind of informal night watch too, worth mentioning briefly, not out of any sense of danger or threat, but simply because a community sharing close quarters, with grain stores and livestock representing real accumulated value, generally found it sensible for someone to stay reasonably alert through at least part of the night. This was rarely a formal, assigned duty in a small village like this one, more often simply whichever household happened to have someone awake anyway, a new parent up with a restless infant, an older person whose own sleep had grown lighter and less predictable with age, keeping half an ear out for anything genuinely unusual while the rest of the village slept soundly around them. The moon tonight sits low and generous over the water, throwing a long, wavering silver path across the surface of the Nile that shifts and reforms with every small ripple of current, and there is something in that image, something I keep coming back to, about how the same river that gave this whole world its bread and its trade and its very sense of time also gave it this, simply, freely, every clear night, a long bright path across dark water, leading toward nothing in particular except the far bank and the fields beyond it, beautiful for no practical reason at all, existing purely generously for whoever happened to be awake and looking. Let us step back for a moment into daylight, not because the night is not where we are ultimately headed, but because there are still a few corners of this world worth wandering through before we let it settle fully into rest. And one of them is the particular relationship this whole civilization had with its own animals beyond the cats and donkeys and cattle we have already met. Baboons, somewhat surprisingly to a lot of people, were kept as pets among wealthier households, associated with the god Thoth, and valued for a kind of clever, almost unsettling intelligence that Egyptians observed and respected, sometimes even trained to help harvest fruit from tall trees, a genuinely practical use for an animal that could climb far more easily and safely than any human household member. Geese and ducks, kept in modest numbers by most households with any land to spare, provided both eggs and on special occasions meat, and were sometimes depicted in art with real individual character, a particular goose apparently notable enough to certain artists to be rendered with something approaching personality rather than as a generic bird shape. Falconry existed too, though in a more limited, specialized form than it would take in later medieval cultures. Certain birds of prey trained and kept, sometimes for practical hunting purposes, and sometimes purely for the prestige and pleasure of keeping such an impressive creature close at hand. And bees, kept in simple cylindrical hives made of dried mud or woven materials, provided the honey that sweetened festival cakes and preserved certain foods, a practice depicted clearly enough in tomb paintings that historians have been able to reconstruct Egyptian beekeeping methods with real confidence. Smoke used to calm the hive during harvesting, in essentially the same basic technique still used by beekeepers today. One more small thread connecting this ancient world directly to ordinary practices that have simply never needed to change very much because they already worked. Harvest time itself, which we touched on earlier as part of the broader agricultural calendar, deserves a slightly closer look because it represented one of the most intensely social periods of the entire year, work that no single family could reasonably manage entirely alone, drawing neighbors together in a shared effort that shifted day to day from one family's fields to the next until every harvest in the immediate area had been brought safely in. This cooperative rhythm meant that harvest season, despite being physically demanding, exhausting work under a punishing sun, carried within it a genuine current of celebration and community, songs sung to keep a shared rhythm going as sickles moved through standing grain, shared meals at midday under whatever shade could be improvised, children old enough to help gathering cut stalks into bundles while running informal races to see who could gather fastest, turning even genuinely hard labor into something with its own thread of play and companionship woven through it. The threshing that followed harvest, separating grain from stalk, typically involved driving cattle or donkeys in circles over the cut grain spread across a hard-packed threshing floor, their hooves doing the work of breaking the grain free, followed by winnowing, tossing the mixture into the air with wide, flat baskets so the wind could carry away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell back down to be gathered. This whole extended process, cutting, gathering, threshing, winnowing, storing, represented weeks of intense coordinated labor, and the moment when the final grain was safely sealed into storage jars and pits, protected against moisture and pests for the months ahead, was met, understandably, with real relief and real celebration, a harvest festival that most families in a village like this one looked forward to, with genuine anticipation the way a modern family might look forward to a major holiday. Beer, brewed specially and in larger quantities for exactly this occasion, flowed freely during harvest celebrations, and musicians, the same reed flutes and hand drums we heard drifting through the village earlier this evening, would play late into the night, dancing breaking out in the open space near the threshing floor, the whole community briefly relieved of its ordinary daily rhythm and allowed, for a few precious nights, to simply enjoy the fruit, quite literally, of months of careful, patient labor. Let us come back now, gently, to where we actually are in this particular night, because the harvest celebration we just wandered through belongs to a different point in the yearly cycle than the evening currently settling over the village, and I only wanted to visit it briefly, the way a mind wanders sometimes toward a favorite memory even while sitting quietly in an entirely different, equally peaceful moment. Tonight, this particular ordinary night, is simply itself unremarkable by any festival calendar, and there is a kind of grace in that too, in an evening that asks nothing special of anyone, that exists purely as one more link in an unbroken chain of evenings very much like it, stretching back and forward further than any single life could ever measure. There was a wedding in the village a few months back, and it is worth visiting for a moment, because it says something real about how celebration and ordinary life folded into each other in this world, without much separation between them. A young woman named Ta Sherit, a niece of Hunero the weaver, married a young farmer from a household a short walk further along the riverbank, and the whole affair, by the standards of grander cultures across history, was remarkably understated. There was no lengthy religious ceremony, no formal vows recorded in any surviving text from ordinary households like this one, simply a gathering of both families, a shared meal considerably more generous than an ordinary evening's fare, and the couple's decision, quietly and mutually made, to begin living together as husband and wife from that point forward. What made the day feel significant was not ritual but abundance, more food than usual, music brought in for the occasion, neighbors contributing what they could, a jar of good beer here, a woven length of fine linen there, small gifts meant to help the new household get properly established. Tasherit's mother had spent weeks beforehand preparing a modest dowry, household items mostly, cookware, a chest for storing linens, a few pieces of simple jewelry, since a bride's family typically provided this kind of practical foundation for a new household, while the groom's family, in many documented cases, provided a share of property or goods of roughly comparable value, the whole arrangement functioning less like a formal transaction and more like two families pooling resources to give a new, young household its best possible start. There is a marriage contract in Tasherit's family's possession now, carefully stored, outlining exactly what property belongs to her individually within the marriage and what would happen to it in the event the marriage ever ended. And this detail matters because it reflects something we touched on earlier about the genuine legal standing Egyptian women held within their own marriages, property explicitly protected as theirs, regardless of what happened between husband and wife, a level of individual economic security that many women in far later historical periods, in far different parts of the world, would not enjoy for centuries afterward. The house Tasheret and her new husband settled into was built in the same familiar mud brick style as every other home we have visited tonight, though newly constructed for their arrival, close enough to both families that the ordinary daily rhythms of visiting, borrowing, and mutual help could continue easily. A typical Egyptian house of this kind was built around a small central courtyard, whenever space allowed, open to the sky, providing both light and ventilation to the rooms arranged around it, and often containing a small domed granary, a beehive-shaped storage structure built from the same mud brick as the house itself, used to keep the household's grain supply dry and protected from pests, raised slightly off the ground on a low platform to guard against the rare but genuinely damaging possibility of flooding reaching further inland than usual. Tasheret keeps a small garden in her own courtyard now too, following the same pattern Nofret's family established, a few herbs, a modest vegetable patch, and a young sycamore sapling planted the week they moved in, small and unremarkable now but destined, if it survives, to eventually offer real shade to whatever children this new household might eventually raise beneath it. There is something I find myself circling back to, again and again, the longer we spend in this world tonight, which is how much of what actually filled an ordinary Egyptian life was not grand or dramatic in any way at all, was instead exactly this: a newly planted tree, a carefully negotiated marriage contract, a domed granary keeping grain dry through an uncertain season, a mother packing a practical dowry with the same careful attention a mother today might bring to helping a grown child furnish a first apartment. The pyramids and the pharaohs and the great temples get all the attention. Understandably, they are extraordinary, but they were never actually where most of this civilization's 4,000 years of lived human experience actually happened. That happened here, in exactly this kind of evening, in exactly this kind of small, warm, entirely ordinary house, out past the edge of the cultivated fields, where the desert begins its long, pale stretch toward the horizon. There is a small settlement of quarry workers, men who spend their working lives cutting limestone from the low cliffs that run along parts of the Nile Valley, stone destined for all manner of ordinary building projects, not only the grand royal monuments people tend to picture first, but modest local temples, official buildings, occasionally even the homes of wealthier families who could afford real stone construction rather than mud brick. This work was hard, genuinely demanding physical labor, cutting and hauling stone using little more than copper chisels, wooden wedges soaked with water to help split the rock along its natural grain, and enormous coordinated human effort to move the finished blocks any real distance. And yet even here, in a settlement built around some of the hardest ordinary labor this civilization required, life retained its own familiar shape, families living together in simple housing provided near the work site, meals shared communally, a small local shrine tended faithfully, children playing in whatever open space existed between the workers' modest homes, a whole small, complete, ordinary world existing in the shadow of the extraordinary structures its labor helped to build. There is a small, strange fact I have been saving, in a way, because it always makes people smile when they hear it for the first time, and this feels like the right quiet moment to share it. Ancient Egyptians developed a form of toothpaste of all things, a mixture that generally included crushed rock salt, dried mint, dried iris flower, and a small amount of pepper, ground together into a paste used with a simple chew stick, a frayed twig that functioned something like an early toothbrush. Dental problems, it turns out, were actually a genuine and fairly serious health concern across ancient Egypt. largely because of that gritty, sand-contaminated flour we discussed earlier in connection with Meret's bread. And dentalware shows up so consistently in examined Egyptian remains that some scholars consider it one of the most reliable ways to estimate a person's approximate age from their skeletal remains alone. The steady erosion of tooth enamel functioning almost like the rings of a tree. Mathematics, too, threaded quietly through daily life in ways that rarely announce themselves as mathematics at all. We touched earlier on the rope stretchers who remeasured field boundaries after each flood, but this same practical mathematical knowledge extended into nearly every transaction and task of an ordinary day. A farmer estimating how much seed grain a given field would require, a merchant calculating the proper trade value between unlike goods using the Deben system mentioned earlier, a builder working out the correct proportions for a mud brick wall that needed to bear real structural weight without collapsing. Egyptian mathematics, as preserved in surviving texts like a well-known scribal training document, sometimes called the Rind Papyrus, handled fractions, area calculations, and even fairly sophisticated problems involving the division of goods or labor among unequal shares. All of it developed not from abstract intellectual curiosity primarily, but from exactly this kind of pressing, practical daily necessity, the genuine engine behind most of the ancient world's mathematical progress. Cosmetics, we discussed earlier in connection with coal specifically, extended further than eye paint alone, and it deserves a gentle mention that men used cosmetics just as commonly as women throughout most of Egyptian history, a detail that tends to surprise modern audiences who often assume, incorrectly, that personal adornment was primarily or exclusively a feminine concern in this world. Scented oils, kohl, and even certain reddish tints applied to lips and cheeks appear in depictions of men across every social class, from farmers dressing modestly for a festival to officials maintaining a polished, well-groomed appearance as a genuine marker of professional respectability. There was no particular stigma attached to a man caring visibly about his own appearance, no cultural expectation that grooming belonged to one gender rather than the other, simply a shared, practical, climate-driven understanding that skin needed oil, eyes needed protection from glare and infection, and looking well cared for reflected well on a household regardless of which member of it happened to be doing the caring. Beer, one more time, because it genuinely was this central to daily life and deserves a final brief return before we let this particular thread rest. There were multiple varieties beyond the basic daily brew we discussed with Meret earlier, some flavored with dates for extra sweetness, some brewed stronger for festival occasions, and surviving records even list what appears to be something close to a graded ranking system, certain beers described in terms suggesting quality tiers not unlike how we might casually distinguish a basic table wine from something reserved for special occasions today. Workers on state projects, including some of the very quarry laborers we visited a short while ago, received a portion of their daily wages directly in beer and bread, a practice so consistent and so well documented that historians consider it essentially confirmed as the standard baseline compensation for a full day's ordinary labor across a huge stretch of Egyptian history. Bread and beer functioning less like simple food and drink and more like the actual, literal currency of daily survival for a very large portion of the working population. Childbirth in this village, when it happened, was managed almost entirely by women, gathered around the mother in a dedicated space, sometimes a specially built small structure just outside the main house, open to the air and decorated with protective images, including, quite often, that same friendly squat figure of Bez we have met several times tonight, watching over exactly this vulnerable and hopeful moment. Pesachet, the physician we met earlier, would very likely have been present for at least some of the births in a village this size, alongside experienced female relatives and neighbors whose accumulated practical knowledge, passed down entirely through direct experience rather than any written text, made them genuinely skilled attendants regardless of any formal title. Egyptian women were encouraged to give birth in a crouching or kneeling position, supported by birth bricks, low platforms that provided both physical support and, in the Egyptian understanding, spiritual protection, since childbirth itself was considered a moment of genuine danger, requiring real divine attention and care. Naming a new baby carried its own small, meaningful ritual, names often chosen to honor a particular god, to express a hope for the child's future, or simply because the sound and meaning of the name pleased the parents, not unlike how names are chosen in most cultures across most of human history. A child might be named something meaning beautiful day, or beloved of a particular god, or, in a detail that always strikes me as quietly funny and human, occasionally something more blunt and practical, a name essentially meaning the ugly one, deliberately chosen, according to some historians' interpretation, to ward off jealous supernatural attention from a child too openly praised or admired, a superstition that shows up, in one form or another, across a genuinely wide range of unrelated cultures throughout history. This quiet, protective impulse to slightly undersell a beloved child's beauty out loud, just in case. Elderly family members, people like A, generally remained within the household or very close to it as they aged, cared for by children and grandchildren rather than by any separate formal institution. And this arrangement reflected a broader cultural expectation, documented explicitly in surviving wisdom texts, that caring for aging parents represented a genuine moral obligation, one of the clearest markers of a person's basic decency and good character. One surviving piece of ancient Egyptian moral instruction, written as advice from a father to a son, explicitly urges the son to remember and repay the physical care his own parents gave him in infancy by extending the same patient care back to them in their old age, a piece of advice that would not sound remotely out of place if it were given, in more or less identical words, by a parent to a child anywhere in the world today. Family bonds more broadly extended well beyond the immediate household in this world. Cousins and aunts and grandparents woven into daily life far more thoroughly than tends to be typical in many modern arrangements, households often standing close together specifically because of these extended family ties, cousins growing up practically as siblings, grandmothers helping raise grandchildren as a matter of course rather than occasional visit. This closeness shows up again and again in the small details we have been gathering all evening, Hunero being Tasherit's aunt, I functioning as an informal elder for children who are not his direct grandchildren but might as well be, the whole village operating less like a collection of separate, private households and more like one large, loosely extended family sharing a single stretch of riverbank. Let us return one more time to I and the children gathered near his doorway, because there is a bit more of that particular evening worth lingering on before it too settles into rest. After the myths and the local legends, I often turns, on a good night, to a game rather than a story, and this evening was no exception. A board pulled out and set carefully in the last of the lamplight for a round of senet, which we discussed briefly earlier as one of Egypt's most beloved and enduring games. The rules, reconstructed by historians from a combination of surviving boards, illustrated instructions found in some tomb paintings, and educated comparison with related games from neighboring cultures, involve moving a set of pieces along the 30 squares of the board according to throws of small flat throwing sticks, with certain squares carrying special meaning, blessing a piece with safety or sending it backward, a house of happiness alongside a house of water that could set a careless player's progress back considerably. Pentu, before finally succumbing fully to sleep, managed one round against I this particular evening, and lost, cheerfully, the way children generally do lose to an opponent who has had several decades more practice than they have, and there was real, easy laughter in that small moment, the particular warm, unforced laughter that belongs to an ordinary evening among people who genuinely enjoy each other's company, no different in its essential texture from a grandfather beating a grandchild at checkers on a porch somewhere, in some entirely different century, in some entirely different part of the world. Another game, Mehen, played on a circular board carved in the shape of a coiled serpent, was popular in earlier periods of Egyptian history, its exact rules less fully understood by modern scholars than senets, since fewer detailed instructions survive. But the board's distinctive coiled shape shows up often enough in archaeological finds to confirm it held real, sustained popularity for a considerable stretch of time before eventually fading from common use, replaced gradually by senet's rising dominance as the game of choice across most of Egyptian society. There is something worth noticing in that quiet, unremarked shift too, a favourite pastime slowly falling out of fashion over generations, the way board games and small entertainment still drift in and out of popularity now, no grand historical event marking the change, simply one game gradually preferred over another until, eventually, almost no one remembered exactly how the older one had even been played. There is one more household worth visiting tonight, before we let this village settle fully, and it belongs to a carpenter named Merrymose, whose workshop sits between the potters and the sandal makers, filled with the particular smell that has probably stayed more or less unchanged in woodworking shops across every century since. Sawdust and resin and the faint, sharp tang of the copper tools he uses to shape and smooth imported cedar into furniture that only the wealthier households in the region can afford. Merrymose himself comes from a long line of woodworkers, and his hands carry the particular calluses and small permanent nicks that mark a lifetime spent working with sharp tools and stubborn material. And this evening he is finishing a small wooden chest, the kind used to store linen and household valuables, its surface carved with a simple, repeating pattern of lotus blossoms that he has cut so many times over the years he no longer needs to sketch a guide before beginning. Egyptian carpentry, without the benefit of iron tools, which arrived in Egypt relatively late compared to some neighboring cultures, relied almost entirely on copper and, later, bronze, chisels and adzes and saws, tools that dulled quickly against hard cedar and needed constant resharpening, a whole secondary skill that every serious carpenter had to master alongside the actual joinery and carving. Joints were cut and fitted with real precision, since good glue, made from animal hide boiled down into a strong adhesive, was valuable and used carefully rather than generously, meaning a well-made joint needed to hold largely through the quality of its actual carpentry, rather than relying on the glue to compensate for sloppy work. Merrymose learnt this the hard way as a boy, apparently, ruining more than one piece of expensive imported wood before his father's patient correction finally took root, and he tells this story now, occasionally, to his own apprentice, a distant nephew sent to him specifically to learn the trade, with the particular fond exasperation of someone remembering his own younger self's mistakes without too much lingering embarrassment about them. Nearby, in a modest house set slightly apart from the others, lives a woman named Nebeta, who holds a role in the village that does not map neatly onto any single modern profession. Part healer, part something closer to what we might now call a midwife's assistant, part keeper of practical household knowledge that gets passed, almost entirely through spoken instruction, from one generation of village women to the next. She is the person Iset consults when a child develops a persistent cough, the person who knows which specific combination of dried herbs, carefully measured, tends to ease a fever without doing any harm, the person whose accumulated, unwritten expertise represents a genuine and valuable form of medical knowledge, even though no scribe has ever bothered to record a single word of it. Nebeta learnt most of what she knows from her own grandmother, who learned it from hers, an unbroken chain of women passing forward exactly the kind of practical, hands-on knowledge that never made it into the grander medical papyri written by trained male physicians in the larger towns, and yet was, in its own quiet way, every bit as essential to keeping this particular village healthy. I find myself wanting to linger here for a moment, on Nebeta specifically, because so much of what we have been able to reconstruct about ancient Egyptian daily life comes, understandably, from what got written down, and what got written down tended to be produced and preserved by a fairly narrow slice of society, trained scribes, temple officials, the literate minority. Women like Nebeta, and for that matter women like Merit and Honero and Iset, lived lives every bit as full and complex and skilled as the more thoroughly documented lives of scribes and officials, and it is worth sitting, honestly, with how much of that fuller picture we can only approach sideways, through careful archaeological inference, through the occasional lucky survival of an ordinary object or an ordinary grave, rather than through any direct written record these women left behind in their own words. Their knowledge mattered enormously to the people around them while they were alive. It simply did not get recorded in the same way a scribe's tax tally or a physician's medical text did, and that gap in the record is worth acknowledging honestly rather than papering over. The evening deepens further now, and across the village, one by one, the small circles of oil lamp light begin winking out, each household finishing its own particular version of the same ordinary day, banking a fire, checking a sleeping child one final time, murmuring a last quiet word to a spouse before rolling over towards sleep. Merimo sets down his tools for the night, the finished chest waiting to be delivered tomorrow to a household a short walk further along the river. Nabetta checks, one final time, the small collection of dried herbs hanging from her rafters, making sure nothing has been disturbed by the day's heat or humidity, before finally allowing herself to rest as well. There is a particular stretch of riverbank, just past the edge of the cultivated fields, where a handful of the village's older boys sometimes gather in the very last hour before full sleep claims everyone, not for any specific purpose, simply because it is a good place to sit, close enough to the water to hear it clearly, far enough from the houses to feel a small, harmless sense of independence from the watchful eyes of parents and grandparents. Pentu, on nights when he manages to stay awake long enough, sometimes joins this loose, informal gathering, though tonight, as we already know, sleep claimed him considerably earlier than usual after a full day of fishing and games and eyes stories. On other nights, though, this is where boys his age talk about the things boys that age have probably always talked about, half real ambitions and half pure invention. Who caught the biggest fish this month? Whether the stories about a particular stretch of river being haunted by an old restless spirit hold any truth to them. The easy meandering conversation of young people with nowhere urgent to be and no particular reason to hurry toward whatever comes next. Further along, past where the cultivated land finally gives way entirely to open desert, the quarry workers we visited earlier are settling into their own version of this same nightly rhythm, a hard day's labor finished, a communal meal shared, and now, in the last hour before sleep, a few of the older men sit together near a small fire, talking quietly among themselves in the particular unhurried way that people talk when the day's work is genuinely, fully done and there is nothing left to accomplish before morning except rest. Their settlement sits closer to true silence than the village does, fewer households, fewer voices, the desert itself pressing its own particular kind of vast, star-heavy quiet in against the edges of the small human space they have carved out of it, and there is something in that different quality of silence, thinner somehow, more exposed, that makes the warmth of their small fire and their quiet conversation feel especially valuable, a small deliberate pocket of human warmth held carefully against an enormous, indifferent dark. Let us step back once more into the fuller shape of an ordinary day, since there are threads from earlier still worth following further, and this quiet hour of the night seems like exactly the right time to let the mind wander a little more broadly across everything this world actually contained. Clothing, which we touched on earlier in connection with linen and the market, deserves a slightly closer look at how it actually changed, subtly, across a person's life and across the seasons, because even a culture famous for the relative consistency of its basic garments still made room for real variation depending on circumstance. Working clothing, worn by farmers and fishermen and craftsmen through the heat of an ordinary day, tended toward simple kilts for men, a wraparound skirt secured at the waist, and for women a simple sheath dress, straight cut and typically held up by one or two shoulder straps, both garments made from plain, undyed linen that could be washed easily and repaired without much fuss when it inevitably wore thin at the knees or the elbows from daily use. Festival clothing, by contrast, even for ordinary households, tended to be finer, sometimes a second, better-made garment kept specifically for exactly these occasions, along with the addition of jewelry, a fresh application of kohl, and often a cone of scented fat worn atop a formal wig, which melted slowly over the course of an evening's celebration, releasing a pleasant fragrance and leaving a faint sheen down the wearer's neck and shoulders, a detail preserved vividly in tomb paintings, and one that always strikes modern audiences as strange until you consider it essentially as an ancient, ingenious form of perfume, releasing its scent gradually across an entire evening rather than all at once. Children's clothing, as mentioned earlier, tended to be minimal or entirely absent for younger children, both for practical reasons related to heat and cost, and this remained true across a genuinely long stretch of Egyptian history, a culture entirely unbothered by a standard of modesty that many later societies would apply far more rigidly to the bodies of the very young. Color, interestingly, played a smaller role in Egyptian clothing than you might expect from a culture so visually vibrant in its art and architecture. Most everyday linen remained its natural pale, undyed color, partly because dyeing linen effectively was technically difficult and expensive, the fiber itself resisting many dyes far more stubbornly than wool did, and partly because the bright, clean whiteness of well-bleached linen was itself considered genuinely attractive and a real marker of careful household management, a family that kept its clothing properly clean and bright, reflecting well on whoever managed the household's laundry, almost always the senior woman of the house. Washing linen, in fact, represented its own significant and physically demanding household task. Cloth beaten against smooth stones at the riverbank, worked with a natron-based cleaning agent, and laid out to dry and bleach further under the direct Egyptian sun, a task typically handled by professional launderers for wealthier households, but managed personally, at considerable physical effort, by women like Merit and Iset in more ordinary homes. Let us turn, for a little while, toward the particular texture of an Egyptian childhood a bit more fully than we have so far, since children have moved through nearly every scene we have visited tonight without ever quite becoming the full center of attention themselves. Egyptian childhood, by the standards of the ancient world generally, appears to have been treated with a genuine and documented tenderness. Surviving texts including affectionate references to children, toys clearly designed and crafted with real care and attention to a child's specific pleasure rather than simply functioning as miniature adult objects, and archaeological evidence of children's graves treated with particular care and, when a family could manage it, particular tenderness in how the small body was prepared and accompanied into burial. This does not mean childhood in ancient Egypt was easy in the way a comfortable modern childhood might be easy. Child mortality remained a genuine and constant presence in this world, as it did across the entire ancient world without exception. But within that hard reality, the surviving evidence suggests real parental warmth, real attention to a child's happiness and development, rather than the kind of cold, purely functional relationship some people mistakenly assume defined childhood in cultures this far removed from our own in time. Games and toys, which we have already spent some time with tonight, extended further than the ball games and board games already mentioned. Small carved animal figures with movable parts, dolls made from wood or cloth for girls, miniature versions of adult tools that let a child practice, in play, the actual skills they would eventually need in earnest, a small wooden hoe, a miniature grinding stone, toys that blurred the line between pure entertainment and gentle informal preparation for the working life every child would eventually grow into. Swimming, in a country defined so completely by its river, was a skill nearly every child learned early and naturally, taught by parents or older siblings in the calmer, shallower stretches of water near the village, and there is something genuinely lovely in imagining a group of children on a hot afternoon, the work of the morning finished, splashing and playing in water that has flowed past this exact spot for longer than any of them could ever properly imagine, learning to swim in the same river that fed their families' fields and carried their families' boats, and would, eventually, carry their own children in exactly the same way, generation folding into generation the way the flood itself folds one agricultural year into the next. There is a particular corner of the village we have not properly visited tonight, a small workshop belonging to a jeweler named Nachtmin, and though we touched earlier on faience beadwork and simple amulets, actual metalworking deserves a slightly closer visit, since it represents one of the more genuinely skilled and closely guarded crafts in this entire small world. Nachtmin works primarily in copper, and when a wealthier customer commissions something special, small amounts of gold, which arrived in the region through the trade networks we discussed earlier, brought up from mines in the eastern desert and from Nubia further south. Goldworking in ancient Egypt reached a level of technical sophistication that genuinely impresses modern metallurgists studying surviving pieces, techniques for beating gold into astonishingly thin sheets, for granulation, tiny beads of gold soldered onto a surface in decorative patterns, and for inlay work combining gold with semi-precious stones, carnelian and turquoise, and the deep blue lapis lazuli imported from as far away as what is now Afghanistan, an extraordinary trade distance to contemplate for an ancient world often imagined, incorrectly, as far less interconnected than it actually was. Nachtmin's own work this evening involves nothing so grand, simply repairing a bent copper bracelet brought to him by one of the farmers from a neighboring field, a small, unglamorous task that nonetheless requires real skill, careful heating to soften the metal without damaging its existing decorative pattern, careful reshaping, and a final polish that restores the piece to something close to its original condition. This is the overwhelming majority of what actual craftwork looked like in this world, not the grand commissioned masterpieces that survive in museums and get photographed for books about ancient Egypt, but small, ordinary, competent repair and maintenance work, keeping a farmer's modest jewelry functional and presentable for another few years of daily wear, one more small thread in the vast, largely invisible fabric of ordinary maintenance and repair that kept an entire civilization's material culture actually functioning day to day. Let us return, too, to something we touched on only briefly earlier, the particular relationship between Egyptian religious belief and the practical rhythms of an ordinary working life, because there is more worth sitting with here before the night fully claims us. Beyond the great state temples and their elaborate festival calendars, ordinary Egyptians maintained what scholars sometimes call a kind of personal or popular religion, a whole separate layer of practice existing somewhat apart from official temple worship, involving small household shrines like Esets, protective amulets like the ones we discussed earlier, and a genuine felt sense that the divine was present and reachable in the small details of everyday life, rather than confined exclusively to the grand formal spaces of temple architecture. A farmer facing a difficult decision about when exactly to begin planting might consult not only his own accumulated practical knowledge, but also, quietly, a sense of which days felt more or less favorable according to the broader religious calendar. A mother worried about a sick child might combine Nebeta's practical herbal knowledge with a small private prayer to Bez or to Taweret, another protective household deity associated specifically with childbirth and the well-being of young children, depicted distinctively with the body of a pregnant hippopotamus, an image that might strike modern eyes as strange until you consider how genuinely protective and formidable a mother hippopotamus actually is in the wild, fiercely, famously devoted to defending her young against any threat. This blending of the practical and the spiritual, so thoroughly woven together that Egyptians themselves likely never experienced them as separate categories requiring separate justification, runs through nearly everything we have visited tonight. Meret's grinding stone worn smooth by generations of women who likely offered small private thanks alongside their labor, Senbi's boundary markers respected partly out of legal necessity and partly out of a genuine, felt sense that boundaries, properly maintained, reflected a kind of cosmic order worth honoring. Nakt's fishing nets checked each morning with the same careful attention a person might bring to a task they considered, on some quiet level, blessed or watched over. There was no real separation, in this world, between the sacred and the ordinary. No sense that religion belonged in a special, set-aside category distinct from the actual texture of daily labor and daily life. The two simply existed together, inseparably. The way water and the river that carries it cannot really be considered two separate things at all. There is a yearly festival worth visiting now, one we have not yet touched on tonight, sometimes called in modern translation the Beautiful Feast of the Valley, and I want to describe it gently, because on the surface it involves visiting the graves of departed family members, which might sound out of context, like exactly the kind of heavy subject we have been carefully avoiding tonight. But it was not experienced, by the people who celebrated it, as a somber or frightening occasion at all. Quite the opposite. Families crossed to the desert edge where their loved ones were buried, carrying food, flowers, and music, spending the day in what amounted to a joyful family reunion that simply happened to include ancestors who were no longer physically present, a picnic, essentially, shared across the boundary between the living and the dead, treated with real warmth rather than dread. Meret's family observed a smaller, more local version of this custom earlier in the year, walking out to visit the modest grave of Naket's own mother, who had passed several years back, bringing bread and a small jar of good beer, and simply sitting together near the grave for a while, talking, sharing memories, letting Tabiri, who had never actually met her great-grandmother, hear stories about the kind of person she had been, a woman known, apparently, for a particularly sharp sense of humor and an unmatched skill at brewing the specific batch of festival beer everyone in the extended family still, half-jokingly tried and failed to recreate exactly. There is something genuinely lovely in that, a woman's memory kept warm and specific and funny within her family long after her death, sustained not through any grand monument, but through exactly this kind of small, repeated, affectionate storytelling. The concept of the car, which we touched on briefly earlier, meant that this kind of visit was understood as genuinely reciprocal rather than purely symbolic. The offerings of food and drink believed to actually sustain and comfort the departed loved one's spirit, and the conversation, the stories, the music, understood as bringing real warmth and connection across a boundary that Egyptian belief considered far less absolute and far less final than many later religious traditions would come to treat it. Grief, of course, existed too, real and sometimes profound. Surviving texts include genuinely moving expressions of loss and longing for departed loved ones, but the overall relationship with death in ordinary Egyptian family life leaned, on the whole, toward continuity and connection, rather than toward the kind of complete, final separation that can make death feel so uniquely frightening in other cultural traditions. Let us shift now toward something entirely different, the practical business of local justice and dispute resolution. Because this village, like every Egyptian community, needed some mechanism for settling the ordinary disagreements that arise naturally whenever people live closely together and share resources. This mechanism was called the kenbet, a local council made up of respected community members, sometimes including local officials, but often simply senior figures within the community, whose judgment and fairness had earned them real standing among their neighbors. Disputes over boundary lines, over unpaid debts, over inheritance following a death, over accusations of theft or damaged property, all of this fell within the kenbet's ordinary jurisdiction, and surviving records of actual kenbet proceedings, preserved by chance on discarded papyrus fragments, give a genuinely vivid picture of how these disputes actually played out. Witnesses called, evidence weighed, both parties given real opportunity to state their case before a decision was reached. One surviving record, from a community not too different from this particular village, describes a dispute between two brothers over their late father's modest estate, a disagreement that the kenbet resolved by carefully dividing the property according to documented custom, with both brothers required to formally acknowledge and accept the ruling in front of witnesses. There is something almost startlingly familiar in reading these old disputes, a sibling disagreement over inheritance being, apparently, exactly as universal and exactly as fraught across 4,000 years as it remains today, resolved then, as often now, through patient, structured mediation by respected members of the community, rather than through any more dramatic or violent means. There is one more strand of daily life worth pulling on tonight, and it concerns the state's own role in this small village's ordinary rhythm, because Egypt, for all its local texture and village-level self-sufficiency, was also a genuinely large and centrally organized state, and that larger structure touched even a small riverside community like this one in real, tangible ways. Grain collected as tax, as we discussed earlier in connection with the scribe recording deliveries, did not simply vanish into some abstract royal treasury. A meaningful portion of it flowed back into a genuinely functional redistribution system, state granaries maintaining reserves that could be drawn upon during years when the flood came in poorly and an ordinary village's own stores ran short before the next harvest arrived. This system, imperfect and unevenly managed across the many centuries of Egyptian history, nonetheless represented a genuinely early and sophisticated form of centralized famine insurance. One of the practical reasons a civilization built on a single, sometimes unpredictable river was able to sustain itself as successfully as it did across such an extraordinarily long stretch of time. Local officials, appointed by regional and ultimately royal authority but living and working within or near communities like this one, handled the practical business of collecting taxes, organizing labor for state projects during the agricultural off-season when farmers like Senbi might be called upon for a period of service work, and maintaining the kind of records that made the whole system function at all. This labor obligation, sometimes translated as corvée labor, represented a genuine and expected part of ordinary Egyptian civic life, not slavery in the way that word gets used for the genuinely brutal chattel slavery of later historical periods, but a rotating, typically seasonal duty owed to the state, most often during the flood season, when farming itself was impossible anyway, and a farmer's labor would otherwise have gone largely unused, building and maintaining irrigation canals, working on state construction projects, and various other public works absorbed this seasonal labor, and while the work itself was demanding, it was also, by most surviving evidence, compensated with food and, in many periods, wages of a sort, rather than being purely coerced without any material return at all. Senbi himself completed a rotation of exactly this kind of labor 2 years back. Several weeks spent working alongside men from neighboring villages on a canal extension project a fair distance downstream, and he still talks about it occasionally, not with any particular bitterness, but with the specific, slightly wry fondness people often develop for a hard, demanding stretch of shared labor completed successfully alongside strangers who became, briefly and intensely, genuine friends. He learned a card game, or something functionally similar to one, played with painted sticks, from a man he worked alongside during that stretch, a man from a village considerably further south whose accent Senbi still occasionally, affectionately imitates when the memory comes up at a family gathering, much to Iset's amused, long-suffering tolerance. There is something worth sitting with, one more time tonight, in how much genuine functioning complexity existed underneath the surface of what might look, at a glance, like a simple, small, self-contained riverside village. A local Kenbet council resolving inheritance disputes with real procedural fairness, a state redistribution system providing genuine insurance against a bad flood year, a rotating labor obligation that, whatever its real burdens, also created unexpected friendships and shared stories that traveled home with a man like Senbi and became, eventually, small treasured pieces of his own family's collective memory. None of this shows up in the version of ancient Egypt most people carry around in their heads, the pyramids and the pharaohs and the golden funeral masks. It shows up here instead, in exactly this kind of quiet, ordinary, thoroughly interconnected daily life, lived by people whose names, for the most part, no one ever thought to carve into anything more permanent than the memory of their own families and neighbors, and who nonetheless built, together, patiently, generation after generation, one of the longest-lasting and most genuinely remarkable civilizations human beings have ever managed to sustain. Let us drift back, gently, into pure sensation for a while now, because we have covered a great deal of ground tonight, and there is real value in simply resting inside the physical texture of this world a little longer before we finally let it settle into sleep. Think of the specific weight of a full water jar carried up from the river on a shoulder yoke, the way the load shifts and settles with each step, the particular ache that develops low across the shoulders after the third or fourth trip of a morning, an ache so familiar to a woman like Nofret that she has largely stopped noticing it as discomfort at all, experiencing it instead simply as the ordinary physical accompaniment to an ordinary morning task. Think of the sound a papyrus boat makes moving through calm water at dawn, a soft, continuous whisper of reed against river, entirely different from the deeper, more solid sound a larger wooden trading vessel makes, its hull cutting through the same water with a fuller, more resonant note. Think of the particular smell of a freshly plastered mud brick wall, still slightly damp, mineral and earthy, mixing with the drier, dustier smell of the surrounding desert whenever the wind shifts to carry it in from beyond the cultivated fields. Think of the exact texture of well-made linen against skin, cool even in real heat, nothing like the heavier, warmer fabrics that would come to dominate clothing in far colder parts of the ancient world, a fabric genuinely suited, through centuries of accumulated practical knowledge, to exactly the climate it needed to serve. Think of the taste of bread still warm from the oven, slightly gritty in the way we discussed earlier, the specific sourness of properly fermented beer, thick enough to feel almost like a meal in itself rather than a mere beverage, the sweetness of a date eaten straight from a laden palm frond at the height of the harvest season. Think of firelight specifically, not the steady, even glow of the oil lamps we discussed earlier, but the more active, shifting light of an actual cooking fire, orange and restless, throwing moving shadows across a courtyard wall in a way that makes even a familiar space feel, for a moment, gently transformed. Think of the sound of a donkey's hooves on packed earth, a steady, unhurried clop that carries easily across a quiet evening, and a lower, softer sound of bare human feet moving across the same ground, nearly silent by comparison. The whole village's evening soundscape built from exactly this layered mix of animal and human movement, water and wind, distant music and closer conversation. Think too of the particular quality of an Egyptian sunset, which we have not actually paused to properly describe tonight, despite spending an entire evening inside its slow arrival. The sky moving through a genuinely striking sequence of color as the sun drops toward the western horizon, gold giving way to a deep, warm orange, and then, briefly, to a shade of pink and violet that seems almost too vivid to be entirely natural, before finally surrendering to the deep blue and then true black of full night. Egyptians associated the West specifically with death and the afterlife, precisely because this was the direction the sun appeared to travel each evening before its nightly journey, and its promised rebirth each following dawn, and burial grounds, including the modest one where Nakat's mother now rests, were traditionally located on the western side of the river for exactly this reason. The setting sun's daily journey understood as a kind of reassuring, repeated proof that death itself was never truly final, only ever a temporary passage toward guaranteed return. There is a particular comfort available in that belief, whether or not you find yourself sharing it. The idea of watching a sunset not as an ending exactly, but as evidence, offered freshly every single evening, that endings and beginnings are simply two names for the exact same continuous, unbroken process. The sun set tonight over this village the way it has set every single evenings since long before Merit or Nakt or Senbi or any of the people we have spent this evening with were ever born, and it will rise again tomorrow morning, precisely on schedule, the way it always, reliably, faithfully does. There is a specific small memory belonging to Iset that surfaces for her, unbidden, most nights right around this hour, the particular quiet stretch between the day's last task and actual sleep, and it concerns her own mother, gone now for a decade, teaching her, as a girl not much older than Tabury is now, exactly how to judge when a batch of bread dough had risen enough to bake. There was no measurement involved, no counted time, simply a specific, practiced press of 2 fingers into the surface of the dough, feeling for a particular give and spring back that meant the dough was ready, a skill transmitted entirely through repetition and correction, her mother's hand guiding her own the first several times until the specific feeling became something her fingers simply knew, permanently, without her ever needing to think about it consciously again. Iset thinks of her mother often in exactly this way, not through grand dramatic memories, but through small, physical, inherited habits that surface constantly and quietly throughout an ordinary day. The specific way she folds a piece of linen, the particular tone she uses, almost without noticing, to soothe a fussy child, an entire inheritance of small physical knowledge passed down mother to daughter with no ceremony at all, simply absorbed through years of proximity and repetition. This is its own kind of continuity, I think, quieter and less visible than the great cosmic cycles of sunset and sunrise we were just discussing, but every bit as real, every bit as important to how an actual human life gets built and passed forward, generation folding gently into generation through nothing grander than the shared, accumulated wisdom of 10,000 ordinary days. Senbi, for his part, carries his own version of this same quiet inheritance, a particular way of testing soil moisture with the back of his hand that his own father taught him in this exact field, a habit so deeply ingrained now that he performs it almost unconsciously several times through an ordinary working day, the specific temperature and texture of the earth telling him things about the coming days that no amount of formal instruction could have taught nearly as effectively as this patient, repeated, physical apprenticeship at his father's side. He hopes, quietly, without ever quite putting the thought into words, that his own young nephew, currently tending the household's small herd of cattle, will absorb this same knowledge from him in turn, the same way it was given to him, not through any formal lesson, but simply through years of shared presence in the same fields, watching the same river, learning to read the same soil. This is, I think, one of the truest and least often told stories about a civilization as genuinely ancient as this one, not the story of pharaohs and monuments and grand dynastic ambition, but this quieter, steadier story of ordinary knowledge passed patiently from hand to hand across an almost unimaginable span of time. a woman's particular touch on rising bread dough, a farmer's particular read on the moisture of his own soil, a fisherman's particular feel for where the fish are likely gathering on any given morning, each small skill representing thousands of accumulated hours of attention and correction, inherited freely, given without any expectation of formal repayment beyond the simple, quiet hope that it will be passed onward again in turn. The night has fully settled now across every corner of this small world we have spent the evening exploring together, and there is a particular stillness to this specific hour, later than full darkness but earlier than the deepest, most unconscious part of sleep, when even the last restless household finally fully surrenders to rest. Somewhere, very faintly, a night bird calls once from somewhere out in the marshes where Amenhotep hunted waterfowl earlier today, and then falls silent again, the sound swallowed entirely by the enormous, patient quiet of the river and the fields and the sleeping desert beyond them. There is one final scene I want to bring you into before we let this village rest completely, a scene that pulls together several of the threads we have followed tonight into one last quiet moment. Ta-Sheret, the young bride we met earlier, and her new husband, whose name is Nesamun, are sitting together on the flat roof of their small new house, exactly the kind of rooftop space we discussed earlier tonight, used for sleeping through the hottest stretches of summer, and on nights like this one, simply for sitting quietly together after a full day's separate labor, him in the fields, her managing the new household's early, still slightly unfamiliar rhythms. Their conversation is unremarkable in the best possible sense, the small, comfortable talk of two people still learning the specific shape of a life together, what tomorrow's tasks will look like, whether the sycamore sapling planted the week they moved in seems to be taking root properly, a small worry about whether Nesamun's mother approved, fully, of the wedding gifts Ta-Sheret's family provided, a worry Nesamun gently, genuinely reassures her about. There is real tenderness in this ordinary exchange, the particular tenderness of a marriage still new enough that every small shared decision still carries a slight thrill of novelty, of building something together for the very first time rather than simply maintaining something long since established. Above them, the same enormous spread of stars we discussed earlier holds its patient, undimmed watch, and Nesamun at one point points out a particular bright star low on the horizon, mentioning, with the easy confidence of someone who learned it from his own father exactly the way Senbi learnt to read soil moisture from his, that this is one of the star's priests at the nearby temple town used to help mark the correct hour for certain nighttime rituals, a small piece of practical astronomical knowledge passed down through ordinary conversation rather than any formal education, the kind of knowledge that belongs to everyone in a community like this one, freely shared, freely inherited, needing no scribe or temple to preserve it, because it simply lives on, faithfully, in exactly this kind of quiet rooftop conversation between a husband and a wife on an ordinary night early in their marriage. Ta-Sheret leans, eventually, into her husband's shoulder, and neither of them says much of anything for a while after that, simply sitting together in the specific, comfortable silence of two people who have decided, quietly and without any grand declaration, that they are genuinely glad to have found each other, watching the same river that has watched every single person and every single household we have visited tonight, moving past below them in the dark, patient, unhurried, indifferent to any of it, and yet somehow, impossibly, holding all of it too, every single quiet, ordinary, deeply human moment that has unfolded along its banks across more centuries than anyone, even the most careful and dedicated scholar, could ever hope to fully count. Eventually, they too climb down and settle in for the night, joining every other household we have visited across this long, warm evening in the same simple, universal act of finally, gently letting the day go. Before we return fully to that same settling rhythm across the rest of the village, there is one more small, curious detail worth sharing, because it has been sitting quietly at the edge of tonight's story since we first mentioned oil lamps a while back, and it deserves its proper moment. Egyptian households, especially wealthier ones but occasionally more modest homes too, when the specific need arose, sometimes used a particular trick to keep insects away from a lamp's flame during the warmer months, adding a small amount of natron or certain bitter herbs directly to the lamp oil, which apparently discouraged moths and other small flying insects from gathering around the light in the way they otherwise would, a small practical piece of accumulated household wisdom that meant a family could enjoy their evening lamplight without constantly swatting away unwanted, distracting company. It is such a small thing, barely worth mentioning in the grand sweep of a civilization's history, and yet I find myself genuinely charmed by it. The idea of some patient, unnamed household experimenting, probably across many irritating evenings, until they landed on a solution simple enough to be worth remembering and passing on to the next household, and the next, until it became just one more small, unremarkable piece of ordinary domestic know-how carried forward the same quiet way as Iset's bread testing technique or Senbi's soil reading. The granary attached to Senbi and Iset's courtyard, the same domed mud brick structure we discussed earlier, sits full tonight, this particular point in the year, comfortably positioned between one harvest safely stored and the next flood still some months away, and there is a real, specific comfort in that fullness, a household's basic security made tangible and countable in a way that feels, even now, genuinely reassuring to think about. Grain stored properly, protected from moisture and from the small rodents that even the village's collective population of watchful, well-fed cats could not entirely eliminate, could last for a genuinely long stretch of time, and a family's careful management of exactly how much to consume and how much to preserve against an uncertain future represented one of the most basic, essential skills any Egyptian household needed to master, a skill passed down, like so much else we have discussed tonight, through patient example rather than formal instruction. And so gradually, gently, we arrive back at where we actually began this long, slow wander through an ordinary Egyptian evening, the village settling fully now into the deep, unbroken quiet of full night. Every household we have visited tonight finally, completely at rest, their granaries full, their fields tended, their children asleep, their small household gods watching faithfully over doorways that have stood, in one form or another, for longer than any single family living behind them could ever properly trace. There is one last thread worth following before we let the village fully rest, and it takes us back, briefly, to Kai the potter, whose finished vessels sat drying in neat rows earlier this evening, waiting for tomorrow's firing. Tonight, before finally settling in himself, Kai walks one final slow circuit around his workshop, checking each piece the way a careful craftsman always does at the end of a working day, making sure nothing has shifted or cracked during the cooling hours since he set them out. This small, unremarkable ritual, a craftsman's final check before rest, repeats itself in some form across nearly every workshop and household we have visited tonight, Merimo's running a light hand across his newly finished chest, Nachtman setting his repaired tools carefully back in their proper places, Huniero rolling her day's woven cloth with the same careful attention she has given this exact task for decades. There is a quiet dignity in these small, repeated acts of care, a whole civilization's worth of ordinary craftsmanship sustained, day after day, generation after generation, through exactly this kind of unglamorous, faithful attention to small, unfinished details. Kai's youngest son, the one who spent the afternoon keeping the wheel spinning at a steady rhythm, is long since asleep by the time his father finishes this final check, and Kai pauses for a moment at the doorway of their small house, looking in at the boy's sleeping form with the particular quiet satisfaction of a parent watching a child rest after a full, well-spent day. He thinks briefly about how many more years remain before his son's hands grow steady and skilled enough to take over the wheel entirely, and there is no anxiety in that thought, only a kind of patient, settled confidence. The same confidence Nacht feels watching Pentu learn to check a net, the same confidence Senbi feels watching his young nephew tend the family's cattle, a whole village's worth of quiet, unhurried trust that the necessary knowledge will keep passing forward, hand to hand, generation to generation, exactly the way it always has. The last lamp in the village finally gutters out somewhere near the edge of the market, its small circle of warm light collapsing into the same deep, complete darkness that now holds the whole sleeping community, held together, gently, by nothing more than the shared, unbroken rhythm of a river that has never once, in all the uncounted centuries this village has existed along its banks, failed to bring morning back around again exactly when it was needed. I keep circling back, tonight, to a particular idea, and I want to name it plainly here before we finally let this whole world settle into its last deep quiet. So much of what we remember about ancient Egypt, the version most people carry around without ever really examining it closely, is built entirely around the extraordinary, the golden funeral mask, the towering monument, the ambitious king. And all of that is real and worth knowing and genuinely remarkable in its own right. But it was never actually where most of this civilization's lived experience happened. It happened here instead, across 4,000 years of mornings, very much like the one that opened this story, a fisherman checking his nets, a woman shaping bread dough with hands that remembered exactly the right pressure without needing to think about it, a farmer reading his own soil, a weaver's shuttle moving steadily back and forth, a child falling asleep with a small wooden toy still loosely held in one hand. Civilizations, in the end, are not really built from monuments, however impressive those monuments might be. They are built from exactly this kind of accumulated, ordinary, endlessly repeated human effort. One household's granary kept carefully full, one boundary marker respected and maintained, one piece of practical knowledge passed patiently from a parent's hand to a child's, 10,000 times over, across 10,000 ordinary evenings, very much like this one. The pyramids will still be standing, most likely, long after every trace of Merit's small mud brick house has dissolved back into the same dark, fertile earth that fed her family's bread each morning. But her life, and Narkt's, and Senbi's, and Iset's, and every other quiet, unrecorded life we have spent this evening gently wandering through together, mattered every bit as much while it was actually being lived, filled with exactly the same small joys and small worries and small, hard-won satisfactions that fill an ordinary life today, in whatever quiet corner of the world you yourself happen to be resting in tonight. There is a very particular kind of peace available in that thought, I think, the recognition that an ordinary life, fully and attentively lived, was never actually a smaller or lesser thing than an extraordinary one, simply a different shape of the same basic human effort to build something worth having, to care well for the people around you, to pass forward whatever small, hard-won wisdom you managed to gather across your own limited stretch of years. Narkt will wake before dawn again tomorrow, check the same nets, feel the same particular whisper of reeds in the early morning breeze, and there is nothing remotely tragic in that repetition, only the same deep, steady comfort a person feels returning, night after night, to a bed that fits their body exactly, a rhythm so familiar it has become, itself, a kind of quiet, reliable happiness. The river will still be moving tomorrow morning, exactly the way it moves tonight, carrying the same patient current past the same sleeping households, indifferent and generous in equal measure, asking nothing of anyone except the same trust that has sustained this entire small, remarkable world for as long as anyone here could ever hope to remember. And somewhere, very soon now, the first pale hint of tomorrow's light will begin to touch the eastern sky, and Narkt will wake, and the whole quiet cycle will begin again, exactly as it always has, exactly as it always will. Let us linger, one final time, on the specific texture of this particular night, before we let it close completely around all of us, you included. There is a particular kind of dark that settles over a place with no artificial light at all, a dark that has real depth to it, real dimension, unlike the flatter, greyer version of darkness most of us actually live inside now, dimmed but never fully extinguished by street lights and screens and the distant glow of towns that never quite go fully dark. In this village, tonight, the darkness is complete enough that the stars themselves provide real, usable light, enough to make out the shapes of familiar buildings, the line of the riverbank, the silhouette of the date palms no-fret tends in her garden, everything rendered in soft silver and deep shadow, rather than the more washed-out, artificially lit version of night that has become so normal for so many of us now. There is a particular sound, too, that belongs specifically to this depth of night, quieter than the earlier evening's layered mix of music and conversation and household activity, but never entirely silent, the low, steady murmur of the river itself, joined occasionally by the soft rustle of a night breeze moving through reeds and palm fronds, the very occasional distant call of a night bird, and beneath all of it, so constant it barely registers as sound at all anymore, the collective, quiet breathing of an entire sleeping village, hundreds of people drawing slow, even breath in exactly the same rhythm, entirely unaware of how closely their sleep mirrors the sleep of every household around them, entirely unaware, too, of how closely it mirrors your own breathing right now, slowing, deepening, following this same old, patient rhythm the way it has been doing, gently, since the very first moment you let yourself settle into this story tonight. I want you to notice, if you can, without trying too hard, how heavy your own body has become by now, how far away the effort of staying alert has drifted, how completely this whole long, warm evening beside the Nile has managed to carry you somewhere quieter than wherever you actually started. That is exactly where you are meant to be right now. There is nothing left to understand, nothing left to follow, nothing left to do except let this last, slow stretch of description carry you the rest of the way, the same way the river has carried everything else tonight, patiently, without hurry, toward wherever it is actually headed. Somewhere behind us now, back at the very beginning of this story, the sun was just beginning to touch the surface of the river, turning it from black to that pale rising gold we described at the very start. It feels like a long time ago now, doesn't it? That quiet first light, Nacht checking his ropes, Merritt crouched beside her oven, the whole village slowly stirring into another ordinary, unremarkable, entirely sufficient day. We have walked through so much since then, bread and beer, markets and boundary markers, weddings and workshops, boards games played by lamplight, a river that has carried every part of this story on its own slow, patient current, and now here we are again, at night, exactly where every single one of those ordinary days was always quietly headed all along. There is something worth holding on to in that shape, I think, the way a single day, examined closely enough, contains an entire world within it. Sunrise to sunset to the deep, settled quiet of full night, over and over, each one slightly different, and yet, underneath the small variations, essentially, comfortingly the same. You have your own version of this same shape waiting for you tomorrow, your own sunrise, your own small accumulated tasks and small accumulated satisfactions, your own eventual return, tomorrow night, to exactly this same kind of deep, well-earned rest. Tonight, though, none of that needs your attention yet. Tonight belongs entirely to this river and this sleeping village and the particular, generous quiet that has been slowly, patiently gathering around you this whole time, waiting for exactly this moment to finally, fully take hold. Let your shoulders drop a little further if you can. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands go loose and heavy against whatever they happen to be resting on right now. There is nothing left to figure out tonight, nothing left to plan, nothing left to hold on to except this last slow, settling breath, and the one after it, and the one after that, each one a little slower and a little deeper than the last. The way Merritt's breathing has slowed, and Nacht's, and Senbi's, and Iset's, all of them long since given over completely to sleep, all of them trusting, the way people have always trusted, that the same steady river which carried this entire day will go on carrying everything else too, quietly, faithfully, long after every one of us has finally let go. Even the animals have gone still now, the cats curled tight in their favoured corners, the donkeys standing quiet and half asleep in whatever modest shelter each household provides them, the cattle settled together at the edge of Senbi's field, their slow rhythmic breathing barely distinguishable at this distance from the breathing of the humans sleeping not far away. The whole village in this final hour has become one single unified sleeping organism, every household and every creature within it moving through the exact same patient rhythm, the exact same trust in tomorrow's return, and there is a genuine comfort available in imagining yourself folded gently into that same rhythm now too. One more quiet breath among all the others, one more small, contented ending to one more long, full day. And so we leave them here, gently, exactly where they belong, a whole small world resting easily beside its ancient, patient river, waiting, without any hurry at all, for the same reliable light that has always, faithfully found its way back to them by morning. If you have made it this far with me tonight, still listening, still here, I hope some small piece of this quiet, ordinary world has managed to settle into you the way it settled every single night, into the people who actually lived it, Merritt and Nacht and Senbi and Iset and every other name we gathered along the riverbank this evening, none of them extraordinary in any way that history books would ever bother recording, and every single one of them, in their own small, patient, faithful way, genuinely worth remembering. Sleep well tonight, wherever you happen to be resting, the river will still be there in the morning, and so, in whatever form your own morning takes, will you. The last thing I want to leave with you tonight, before the story finally fully lets you go, is simply this image held gently without any need to do anything further with it. A quiet bend in a wide, slow river, a cluster of small mud brick houses, dark now, resting. A sky so full of stars it seems almost impossibly generous. And underneath all of it, patient and unhurried and endlessly reliable, the same steady current that has carried this entire small, ordinary, deeply human world safely through every single night for longer than anyone in any century could ever fully count. Rest now. There is nothing more the story needs from you tonight, nothing left to hold on to, except this last, slow, settling quiet, carrying you the rest of the way, the same patient way it carried this whole gentle world toward its own well-earned sleep. Good night. Somewhere, right now, the last small light along that ancient riverbank has finally gone dark, and the whole village and the whole quiet, patient world it belonged to has folded itself completely, gently, into sleep, exactly the way you are folding, right now, into your own. The story ends here, quietly, the way the best bedtime stories always do, not with any grand final statement, simply with a whole small world finally, completely at peace, and you, hopefully, drifting along somewhere very close behind it, into exactly the same deep, well-earned rest. Sleep well. Let the river carry the rest of the night for you now. You have nowhere left to be. The lamps are all out now. The village is dark and still and completely, peacefully asleep, and so, very soon, gently will you be too. Good night from this quiet bend in an ancient river to wherever quiet bend in the world you happen to be resting in tonight. Rest easy. Morning will come the same patient way it always does, and everything, exactly as it should be, will still be right here waiting for it. And so, at last, gently, completely, the whole village sleeps. And so, at last, gently, completely, do you. There is nothing left now but rest, deep and complete, the same rest that has settled over this small riverside world every single night for longer than anyone could ever hope to count, patient, familiar, and utterly reliable, waiting quietly for you too, exactly as it always has, exactly as it always will. The village now is as quiet as it will get tonight, and I want to walk through it with you one final time, slowly, the way you might walk through your own sleeping house late at night, checking that everything is exactly as it should be before finally letting yourself rest. The river moves past all of it, unhurried, indifferent in the gentlest possible sense of that word, the same water that watched Nacht check his nets this morning, that carried Renzi's trading boat past the market, that reflected the golden hour light Nofret worked her garden in, now simply moving on through the darkness, toward the delta, toward the sea, carrying nothing more urgent tonight than moonlight and the faint steady murmur of its own current. Somewhere behind a mud brick wall, Tiberi shifts slightly in her sleep, one small hand still loosely curled, though the wooden cat has slipped from her fingers sometime in the last hour, and now rests quietly on the mat beside her, waiting patiently to be found again in the morning. Merit sleeps deeply beside her, the particular unbroken sleep that comes to someone who rose before dawn and worked steadily, without real pause, until the light finally failed. Her hands, even at rest, carry the day's labor in them, faint traces of flour still caught in the creases of her palms, ground grain from a stone that has stood in that same corner of the courtyard for longer than she has been alive, and will very likely still stand there, unmoved, long after this particular night has ended. Nack's small boat rocks almost imperceptibly where it sits tied at the riverbank, the current tugging gently at its hull in a rhythm so constant that it has become for him no different from silence, a sound so familiar it no longer registers as sound at all, only as the simple fact of home. Pentu sleeps soundly nearby, one hand still faintly curled, as though it remembers, even in sleep, the shape and weight of the fishing net he spent the morning checking, the particular rough texture of woven fibre against his palm, becoming, slowly, over years of exactly this kind of repetition, as familiar to him as his own skin. Senbi and Iset's house holds its own quiet now, the small shrine in the corner barely visible, The day's careful measuring of boundaries and water and grain finally, fully finished until tomorrow calls for it again. Their bodies rest with the particular deep, dreamless heaviness that follows honest physical labor, the kind of sleep that asks nothing further of the mind, simply pulling it down and holding it there, gently until morning comes to release it. Hunero's loom sits idle in the dark, the day's woven cloth rolled carefully away, waiting, and somewhere in her own quiet sleep she is very likely dreaming, if she dreams at all tonight, of nothing more dramatic than tomorrow's pattern, the next length of thread, the next steady, patient hour of work that has filled and shaped her whole long life without ever once feeling, to her, like a burden. Nofret's garden breathes its own particular nighttime scent into the dark, damp earth and green growing things, and the faint sweetness of the blue lotus, closed now, waiting for morning the way it waits every single night, patient and certain in a way that feels, if you let yourself sit with it, quietly reassuring, a small living reminder that some things at least can be relied upon completely, that morning follows night as surely as the flood follows the dry season, as surely as sleep follows a long, full day. Renzi's boat rests at its mooring downstream, cargo covered against the dew, ready for a journey that will begin before most of the village has even woken, carrying grain and linen and pottery toward another town, another market, another set of hands that will unload it and carry it onward into lives we will never get to see, into stories that continue on past the edge of what we happen to know tonight, the way every single life eventually does, threading forward into a future that belongs, ultimately, to someone else's evening, someone else's quiet, someone else's rest. A is asleep now too, finally, the last one to give in to it, as is so often the way with people who have lived long enough to know, deeply and without needing to be told, exactly how good an ordinary evening like this one actually is, exactly how much it is worth, simply sitting with a little longer before letting it go. His stories rest with him for the night, the old ones about the sun god's nightly journey, the newer, smaller ones about a particular sycamore tree at the edge of the fields, all of it waiting, patiently, for the next evening a child settles onto a mat near his doorway and asks, the way children always do, to hear it again, and above all of it, above the sleeping village and the moving river and the closed blue lotus flowers and the quiet loom and the covered cargo and the small domed granaries holding tomorrow's bread safe until morning, the sky holds its enormous, undimmed spread of stars, exactly as it has held them every single night since long before this village existed, and will very likely go on holding them long after every trace of it has finally, gently returned to the earth it was built from. There is something in that thought I find genuinely, deeply comforting rather than sad. The idea that this particular sky, this particular quiet, this particular feeling of a whole world finally settling into rest, has happened, essentially unchanged, more nights than anyone could ever count, and will go on happening, long after tonight, long after any of us, under whatever sky each of us happens to be resting beneath. If you are still awake with me here, this deep into the night, I would gently invite you to let that be the last thought you carry with you into sleep. Somewhere, right now, in some quiet corner of the world, a river is moving the way this one moved, patient and unhurried, and a house is settling the way this one settled, and someone's hands, tired from an honest day, are finally allowed to rest. You are part of that same old steady rhythm tonight, whether you think of it that way or not. One more quiet ending to one more ordinary day, folding gently into the enormous, unbroken chain of nights that came before it and the nights that will follow after. Let your own breathing slow to match it. Let your own body grow as heavy and as still as merits, as nakts, as senbis, as isets, resting now beneath their own low mud brick roofs beside their own dark, patient river. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight. There is nothing else you need to do. The village is asleep. The river moves on without needing you to watch it, and you too can finally gently let go.